And we are live. This is Dark Journalist. It's a fantastic crowd out tonight already, asking all kinds of good questions. As usual, I'm joined by the lovely Olivia.
Hi, everybody.
And tonight's going to be something very special. As I announced, we're going to be making some kind of history tonight because we're in a very interesting period of connecting the dots. We're in X series episode 61. And this one is called Operation Atlantis. It harkens back to X Series 36, where we first revealed the JFK Hemingway connection, and also episode 47, X episode 47, just to connect some dots up there. We're going to expand on some themes and really reveal some things that just are not on the books right now. And it's quite remarkable when we get to it because it brings together the worlds of people who are studying things like the very unusual geopolitical machinations going on in Cuba right now. We had this alarming situation with our own diplomats when they went down there, which was very disturbing. And a lot of those came back, and we're going to refer to them as well, because when they came back, they were under electronic harassment, but they were here. So how does that make any sense? If someone was trying to bother them in Cuba, how did those people, when they got back here, why were they still trailing them and breaking into their houses and things? There's a good reason for that, and I'm going to get into it. But the most explosive piece tonight, I'm going to start, Olivia, I always say I like to start with the TKO.
TKO.
And I know there's a lot of news and things to cover as well. There's so many things going on, including the fact that Freedom Watch is suing the DIA for the UFO file, which is funny. They're usually suing for things on Fox News for like Hillary's emails or something else. But this, I think, is a remarkable story. And we're going to be watching that closely. Of course, the Epstein suicide watch. Everyone's been sending me tons of email about that. It is remarkable. Of course, that's a very high profile figure and witness in forthcoming prosecutions. So that guy, I mean, his odds were numbered when he went in.
Can you fill me in? Because I know that there was an incident, but I don't know exactly what happened.
Oh, well, literally, he was found in fetal position, almost dead. He was unconscious, and it was an attempted suicide on his part.
And
that's what it's called
the
officially.
means of attempt?
I'm sure that he probably had something in his room just to, gag himself. But what's remarkable, I think, about it is that he wasn't under greater scrutiny and security. For example, as soon as they got Chelsea Manning, they put her in solitary confinement. They get this guy in the most high-profile situation, and they leave him in a normal room. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense. But I think these stories are developing, and we are keeping our eyes on them. I think also when it gets into some of the things that we've been seeing around John McAfee, who we covered in the episode last week. Now, McAfee's in a very interesting and I'd say important position in all this, because he's somebody who went down to the HotZone, and he was docked in Cuba and talked about starting a crypto revolution. But he's tied in to these incidents and the fact that he was boarded, and he had done all these tweets and released these pictures about being detained over 4 days. And he certainly is enough of a character that you can see there's always legitimate reasons to grab him. But the likelihood of him showing up at Hemingway's villa and getting grabbed 2 days later, I think, tells us we're going in the right direction.
It's just crazy that we were just talking about him last Friday.
Yes.
And there you go.
Well, I think the fact that he said he was running for president in 2020, maybe to inject ideas like this, kind of cryptocurrency awareness thing, is part of it. But there's more than meets the eye in the situation around the HotZone. In Cuba right now, for example, we have the worst sanctions on Cuba that we've had since Castro pulled the Cuban Missile Crisis in 1962 and brought the world to the brink of nuclear war. Now, that brings us directly into the Kennedy era. And, there are elements of the Kennedy assassination in this episode, although the episode is Operation Atlantis. And that's the very interesting thing, is that all this ties into a search for a underwater city that was discovered. And it was originally discovered, at least there are hints of it, in the 50s, but it's announced, and it is actually full-on discovered in 2001 by Paulina Zalitsky. And we have covered a great deal of her discoveries, and we're going to cover them again tonight. I want to get everyone on the same page about what the hot zone is. And I also want to tell you before we go to the TKO that tonight's episode is it really opens everything up in terms of lines of research for what we've been looking for. And when we say it changes history, we're going to deliver on that promise, and I'm going to show you why. So buckle up your seatbelts. We're definitely going into some turbulence. All right, the hot zone. What is the hot zone? The hot zone is an area. No, it's not a movie or a special by National Geographic. It's actually an area that is between Bimini over here and Cuba. Now, this is the main parameter, but it also stretches all the way over here to the Yucatan and the Yucatan Peninsula, and that encompasses this portion of the Caribbean, and back here you have Haiti and Jamaica. Now, the main block of awareness around the hot zone, right in there, that area has incredible ruins that we've seen discovered. I was talking with Graham Hancock's wife when he was here doing the incredible live work on his America Before book, which was remarkable that, we got him here in Cambridge. We felt so lucky. And his book is just off the charts. Finally, science is sort of giving him that kind of clarity and clarification that he brought this stuff forward in the 1990s and early 1990s.
It's finally catching up.
It is amazing, isn't it? And, I think we've seen Graham grow too and go into other spaces of his life and even do fiction and all the rest of it, and then come back to this with a real fervor because finally, there's some back and forth he can do instead of academics just trying to run him out of town or ruin his university visits or whatever it happened to be. But when I was talking to her, she was telling me about a dive over the Bimini Wall that they were doing and how easy that dive was and how it's literally in about 15 feet of water. Very close. Now, of course, the point of the hot zone is that there's a fundamental operation that's been happening, which is a group of countries have been watching a piece of land in the Atlantic for when it rises for two reasons. One, if it arises in international waters, anyone can claim it. It becomes a sovereign place, very strategic in the area. Two, there are ruins that are rising with it. The ruins belong to an older, advanced culture. One of the most amazing pieces of this, bringing in Edgar Cayce's work, is that Edgar Cayce gave us the real hint, and speaking of someone whose work is really getting, some notice now with his work, his predictions really coming true on this. So, of course, Edgar Cayce was the greatest psychic of the 20th century and beyond. Can't really think of a better one. And he worked along the mystery school lines that we've covered on this show, and we've done quite a few on Edgar Cayce. But Edgar Cayce said that Poseidia was the name of the land that was rising, and it was a piece of Atlantis, the most advanced portion, and that they were working with advanced technologies and something he called a two-eye stone, which was a massive crystal technology. And this technology basically had the ability to let the Atlanteans do everything from power their vehicles to communicate with God. There's no other way to put it. And eventually they got more into using it for, kind of heavy duty technological means, and it got darker as they went along and they lost the spiritual application. This is the story, the mystery school story, and it comes down to us through Edgar Cayce on Atlantis. Now, there was a portion that he said there in 1926, originally, when doing readings on Bimini. He said that this Poseidia temple was going to rise and that it was part of Atlantis and that there was a Hall of Records connected with it. Now, when Cayce talks about the Hall of Records, these are special records that this advanced culture left for humanity to rediscover at some point. That the initiates there did this. Now, what's quite unusual is one of his first references says, in the sunken portions of Atlantis or Poseidia, where a portion of the temples will yet be discovered under the slime of ages of seawater near what is known in Bimini. Now later, what's really fascinating is that he went forward and expanded on it in a series of readings. Oddly enough, the follow-up readings on this one were the copy disappeared, which is very rare in Casey readings. But what would happen is he would predict that in 68 or 69, that the first real ruins would rise and right off the coast of Bimini. Now, there was a diver named J. Manson Valentine. Yeah, you got it. Miss Olivia, what is it?
Matt M says, LOL, DJ is stimulating that major acupuncture marine with his hair flip. I figured it out.
Excellent point. Well, you know what they say about hair and magnetism. You're rolling right along with it. So J. Manson Valentine was a diver, and he was a scientist, and he was flying over Bimini in 1968. Lo and behold, he found the Bimini Road. Now, which is known as the Bimini Wall because it seems like a wall to encircle Bimini. Not so far down. It causes a lot of problems for traditional archaeologists and historians because if it's man-made, it means there was a culture there that sank. And even if that culture wasn't Atlantis, it causes them a lot of headaches. Now, you know, a lot of people have mentioned to me, well, and there was a question here last week from Unconscious Zone that we didn't get around to, which was an excellent question, which is, hey, they've been talking about the oceans rising on the East Coast. How are we supposed to get land rising? You know, how does that all work? There is a scientific basis for land rising on the East Coast, and we can use the story of that came out in phys.org in 2016, Santa Maria, the Incredible Rising Island. It doesn't show up so well. There we go. But anyway, phys.org is good for these types of stories and usually incredibly well sourced. Now, in this article, which is written here by Ricardo Ramalho, it says that it's been a well-established fact that as they get older, ocean islands slowly sink. We knew that since Charles Darwin's time, based on observations made during the Beagle's voyage. He correctly formulated that sinking islands start to be fringed by rings of coral reefs. So they go on to say here and basically get around to the point that, yes, traditionally, islands are sinking. However, once in a while, they thrust up out of the ocean. So they say there are a number of small islands that buck this trend, actually rising out of the ocean rather than sinking. This phenomena was seen as rare and mostly associated with fluxural bulge created by younger islands being loaded on the seafloor, which, like opposing sides on a balanced scale, would cause other islands in the periphery to rise while they sink. This is very important because we've been detecting notes of islands sinking and other lands come up when this happens. Now, there's an association in here also with certain types of volcanic activity. And there was a NASA scientist who was really obsessed with the Casey work in the 70s, and he's done those scale models that I've shown of the Two-Eye Stone. Interestingly enough, he also believes that there is volcanic activity underneath the Bimini Islands, and this may be part of what is propelling that island mass up. According to Edgar Casey, that's Poseidia, and that it has this temple with the Temple of Records, Hall of Records from the Atlanteans in it. Now, this is part of the backdrop of this whole drama that plays out in the Hemingway JFK Atlantis connection. So we see now it's scientifically been established that islands rise, and they're talking about the Atlantic Ocean there. That's the mid-North Atlantic, but certainly can happen on the other side. And that article is quite good. I recommend checking it out. Now, a little while ago, I was reading, you know, the Casey Association puts out these bulletins once in a while, which are all about islands and the search for Atlantis. And this one was called, Has the Location of the Center City of Atlantis Been Identified? I want to call our attention to this real briefly. I'm going to read a couple of cues from it. There's a book called Gateway to Atlantis by Andrew Collins, who posited that Cuba was Atlantis. Now, I actually feel that Collins' work is a good foundation as we get into the hot zone area. I think that he did good setup work for this whole idea. In his book, Collins related that a clue was left by the famous treasure hunter Mel Fisher before Fisher's death in 1998. Fisher spoke to Collins and told him he'd initially identified the center city of Atlantis using satellite images. Okay, now that wasn't something we had access to, say, in the 40s, not until the late 50s and early 60s. You know, Sputnik was the first hardcore one that the Soviets did first, and then America put up a ton, and we became the lead. And little by little, the UK and Australia had them up there. And now it seems like everybody puts them up there. And Elon Musk just launched 20,000 of them. So, you know, they're all over the place now. But this satellite technology, in terms of taking pictures of what's underneath the ocean floor, is not something that was around in Casey's time. So he is peering in with his vision and finding this and seeing this. And now we are developing the tools to see what he was telling us was there. Okay. The center city of Atlantis was, according to Plato's account, a circular city 2.5 miles in diameter, ringed by a much larger body of water, making the land immediately around the city about 7 miles in diameter. So he goes and he measures all these things. And he says that during the investigations of Bimini and Andros in 2002 and 2003, one of the other things was they obtained satellite images of Cuba, which were available to this Fisher person back in 1998. In August 2002, they were carefully studied, and these images found a location in Cuba which closely matched many of the descriptions given by Plato. Okay, and it goes on and on to describe why this would be them. Now, what's remarkable about this, for anyone who follows the JFK period and the Cuban Missile Crisis, etc., is the site is an underwater island at Zapata. Okay, now this is right off of the coast of Cuba. It's north of the Isle of Youth and just way to the Bay of Pigs. Are you ready for it? So there's an underwater island there. Check this out. Now this is heavily over-edited, so I'm just going to show you roughly, and then we'll get into kind of better views of Cuba. But this one is an ultra close-up because I really want to point this out. This here, that is the Bay of Pigs, and this is the site of the island. So it's right next to it, literally. Here's your underwater island, and that's the Bay of Pigs. Now, going back into our kind of foreign policy history, the Bay of Pigs is where the United States launched a failed attempt to overthrow Cuba in 1961, only 2 months after President Kennedy got into office. He inherited a plan from the CIA and Allen Dulles. And Allen Dulles is going to play very heavily into this. Now, some people might be watching our reports in the HotZone and say, like, why would the CIA be interested in Atlantis? Well, in 1964, they did an internal study that was declassified in 1998. That study was all about if Casey's Hall of Records existed under the Sphinx paw. It's already been declassified. There's no skeptic that can debunk it. It's an actual document, and there was an actual program to do this, reported by people like Nick Redfern and others. They've had active programs to find Noah's Ark. They've had active programs, and what me and in some of my conversations with Dr. Joseph Farrell, we talk about archaeology wars. So what happens there basically is these groups, because they understand this type of information that's been passed down by the mystery schools, they try to utilize it, and they use the secrecy of their office or their administration or agency in order to keep these searches out of the public eye, because they want to kind of hoard whatever they discover. In the case of Atlantis, there's so many things there. There's the hidden history of the human race, and there's advanced technology. That's enough for us to go on that. So now we have an extraordinary foreign policy event, which is the Bay of Pigs incident, where the CIA tries to invade Cuba using the Bay of Pigs. Now we find, using satellite imagery, that that area is exactly where this underwater island is. So we're bringing these things together, and it's going to make a lot more sense why Hemingway and JFK keep coming up in this regard around Cuba and the HotZone. Yes.
2 questions.
Yeah.
TJ Isaacs wants to know, where can we see photos outside evil Dr. Google Earth?
Well, there are surveys that come out relating to Cuban oceanography. Um, there's a lot of different ways to get your hands on it. I would say that a lot of people do drone photography and all the rest, but that activity has to take place in Cuba. So, things are a little tense over there right now for Americans. So it's probably not the greatest thing to do. But literally, that's the way that it works. Of course, they have unlimited satellite photography of that area on a government level. So it's harder for us here just talking about it. But certainly there are there's oceanography where they do that kind of cataloging. Yes.
The other thing is, Trudy Nichols says there's a video clip of Ghislaine Maxwell selling plots of the ocean.
Yes.
Are we getting around to that tonight at all?
Well, it's very interesting. Let's at least touch on this real briefly. One of the things that's important about New Atlantis and this whole idea of Atlantis rising is that a number of people, including Ernest Hemingway's brother, Les, as we've documented on this program, bought a portion of international waters in the hot zone to basically predicting that land was going to rise there. And that all is because the Hemingways have this incredible background with Casey. And he was giving readings to Hemingway's mother about Ernest Hemingway and other things. And his son, Hugh Lynn, had spent a month in Chicago with the Hemingways. So this is a very tight symbiotic relationship. I wouldn't be surprised if there were even secret readings done along this line, because it's very unusual that we have Ernest Hemingway showing up in Bimini, which was very, very, I've looked at some of the pictures of Bimini in 1935. I mean, it's like there's maybe 100 people living there. It's only 7 miles of island, and it was not even arranged in any kind of livable fashion. But, the cover story was that, oh, well, he loved fishing. Yeah, okay, I can appreciate that. But would that mean you would live there? It's still very unusual. He was going back and forth between Bimini and Cuba, right in the heart of the hot zone. And we have Casey's prediction about this land rising. And then we have his brother founding New Atlantis. Now, a number of celebrities over the years, such as John Lennon, also bought up plots of land in the Atlantic, thinking Atlantis is going to rise there and we can start a sovereign country. Now, the story that you're referring to, Olivia, is really interesting because it shows that this process still continues, but now it's under the guise of ocean conservation. So we have people, buying out these plots of land.
Keyword guys.
But I do feel that maybe, this is through a different guise, through a different mask. This is the same type of activity that's going on. They want to have that portion of land when it rises. First things first, it has to be in international waters. And also they have to be, there's a number of factors, like in terms of the intelligence agencies and their infiltration of these areas, they keep incredible activities in the Bahamas, which is off the charts remarkable, as does NASA. So we can see there's so many people and things in the hot zone. So when we get a major figure in the political scene or just in the spectrum generally, a news guy, a guy who's been in the news like McAfee down there, and then he gets grabbed, that's kind of like a red flag. It has to really inspire our attention to really find out what's going on down there.
It's crazy. So Jardin de Luxembourg asks,
Yes.
Any coincidence that Jeffrey Epstein owns an island near the hot zone? His temple looks like an Egyptian temple. And Tessa1111 says Epstein's island, is it in the Bermuda Triangle?
Oh, really interesting. Well, that island, I think the knowledge that those people have, such as people who put money in the Cayman Islands and all the rest of it, they know something about that area that has to do with the electromagnetic setup of that area. We also know that it's incredibly dangerous to fly planes and ships in that area of the Bermuda Triangle, which the hot zone overlaps directly inside of. So I think that we can think of the Bermuda Triangle and the hot zone as extensions of each other. They're different things. In the Bermuda Triangle, what we have at least if you really take the Casey readings on it, you have something of a technology that's still active, that's still pulling things down the way that it corrupted the continent at the time. So we're looking at other things also, like all the way back to Columbus, we have unusual lights. We have the UFO sightings there. Some quite remarkable in the Bahamas, the more that I study them, and an unusual craft as well. But so many reports of these craft coming out of the water, those are USOs. So the idea being that these are things that are actually built underwater. So what's going on there? It is pretty heavy duty, I have to say. But I think, in order to unwind it, to unwind all of the misinformation that's grown up around this, we need to go back to this period when there was intense geopolitical pressure in Cuba. Because when the Batista regime fell and the Cuban Revolution with Castro came in, it's a massive sea change. And as a result, I believe that those people are not just worried about losing casinos and other things. They're worried about losing the great position in the hot zone for these things that are going on. Because we've seen that the Cuban Archaeology Committee in 1952 decided that the caves off the coast comprised a piece of Atlantis. They were already onto this. Which is why I think the work of Egerton Sykes, who I've pointed out in this program, was a former British intelligence officer who was really deep into the Atlantis material and Casey's material, and who came over here to America to donate his work to the ARE in Virginia Beach. This was his angle on it, which is, there is a massive city there, and this is something that needs to be dealt with. And he's an intelligence guy, so he knows what's at stake with it. Yes.
Breach 123 wanted to ask, wasn't the Philadelphia experiment done in the Bahamas?
Well, it's interesting. Technically, it was done in Norfolk, Virginia, and then in Philadelphia also, both off of the East Coast. And they were done using a combination of Einstein and Tesla's technology with disastrous results. They actually achieved invisibility, but it was early, and from all the details that we have about it, the people who came back had this problem of staying, and the material that came back, it had a problem of staying. So somebody would be there and then they disappear and come back. This was definitely messing around with dimensions before they knew everything that was involved there. But I think the Philadelphia experiment is the one that got away. It's that little story that came out. And remember that one of the main UFO file reporters, Morris Jessup, was the one who helped to bring that out. And he was found on that highway with the carbon monoxide. So, this is the nature of the thing. When those people got close, the ex-protected group came in and would eliminate them. That's how it worked in the 50s and 60s. And then ex-protect grew up their methods over time to be a little less obvious, but still as effective. Okay, so that gives us some idea of the nature of where we are. Now, why? So we understand that there's land rising and that it's connected with an ancient civilization, and that it's, in addition to being an archaeological anomaly, it is also something of great interest for different geopolitical groups. Now, what happened that got Ernest Hemingway involved in all this, and how was he manipulated, and how is his legacy coming out of Cuba such a controversy, and why are the Kennedys involved? We've done a few episodes outlining what those connections were, but through deeper research, more things are coming through that are really going to spotlight what this is, which is really going to blow a lid off of why so much of this material has been over time kept with the Kennedys, and we're going to figure out what that's all about. The way we're going to do it is to look at something kind of startling that is finally starting to make everyone stand up and take notice. This is a picture that accompanied an obituary in 2015 of a remarkable businessman named Joseph Dreyer Jr. And he was standing here with some very interesting people, including his wife, of course, lovely bride. But that's Mary Hemingway, and that's Ernest. Now, the combination of Ernest Hemingway and Joseph Dreyer, who was a major figure that was questioned repeatedly around the JFK assassination because of his time and business in Cuba, kind of really is explosive in this sense. And so this week I was talking with a major JFK researcher who says that this picture changes everything in terms of how they investigate that. The person I was talking to is only interested in the political side of the JFK. They don't care about the Atlantis side. That's my beat, I guess. So, but the person involved there, Joseph Dreyer Jr., was a very powerful foreign policy advocate and advisor for years. And as a matter of fact, one of his roundtables there in living in Palm Beach, Florida, people like Karl Rove during the Iraq War would come down there and get advice from him. Powerful heads of state would come to visit with him. And Dreyer shows up as a remarkable figure. This is him later in life, and his story being told here today in its relation to Hemingway and what happened there with them and major figures with the Kennedys is going to really blow some doors off tonight. Now, one thing I found was interesting is one of the last pictures of his life was here. I thought you'd like this one, Olivia, just because of the pad. So, and he's certainly taken it easy in there. But you can't really see it so well here, but that's a picture of Ernest Hemingway there. At the end of his life, Dreyer still had this incredible kind of fascination for Hemingway, who he spent years with. Now, the story of how they met is very, very interesting also. And I'm going to read directly from his obituary tonight. But what's interesting is, for me, the way it works is that he met Jack Hemingway, who is the father of Margot and Muriel. Now, Jack Hemingway was a CIA agent after he finished his military training. And after World War II, he was actually kept as a Nazi prisoner for a while. When he came back, the CIA made him an agent, along with Julia Child, by the way. They paired those two up, the famous chef. Now,
and that's because they were both in Paris, right?
Yes. Mm-hmm. And I do also feel that, if you look back over the Hemingway children, their godmother is Julia Child. So that's how close. I didn't know that. Yeah, that's how close Jack was.
Wow.
With them. Jack's a very interesting figure because he has an interesting relationship with his dad, which is his dad on one hand, lauded him and really made him act like a man and like get into the military and gave him a lot. But at the same time, Hemingway was so paranoid about the CIA because he knew deeply about their activities. And they also had a habit of really pushing the line and the limit with him because they were very worried about his activities in Cuba and the fact that he had his own intelligence network. And many of them thought he was a double agent and all the rest of it. However, I believe they also were very concerned about his connection with the HotZone and the ruins there. And I think that tonight we're really going to get deeply, deeply into that. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're going deep for X-Steganography episode 61. And this one is Operation Atlantis. And, they had many operations on the CIA side. And I believe that the other end of the fence, what we call X-Protect on this show, the Kennedys, the Hemingways, this group, they launched Operation Atlantis. They wanted to get their hands on this material before these other forces did. And one of the things I've learned about Kennedy over the years that's very important about President John F. Kennedy is that he was excellent at this backdoor channel communication, which is very important. One of the reasons the CIA flipped out so much about JFK when he got into office is they could not monitor his communications, because what he would do is he would take a secret message, put it in a newspaper, and give it to a reporter and say, oh, you're heading over to Berlin today. Go to Berlin, meet so-and-so, exchange newspapers. And he would get a letter from Khrushchev, and Khrushchev would get a communique from him. And they contacted each other without the State Department interference and without the kind of manipulation. Now, we see this now with Putin and Trump to a certain degree, where everyone freaks out when Putin and Trump meet with just their translators, because they want to be able to control that moment, and they want the details, and they don't want them talking about certain things, in my opinion, like the UFO file. So the intelligence agencies always freak out through the media and say, like, oh my God, what are they doing? But I think this is a very important aspect when we look at President Kennedy. Now, President Kennedy in 1962 faced the Cuban Missile Crisis, and what happened there again was that the CIA was trying to goad him into World War III, and they really wanted to take Cuba back and felt that they had the advantage, basically. But also the Soviets had done something very stupid about putting ballistic missiles into Cuba. And so it changed the balance of power. And Kennedy had to find a way out of not invading the island, but also not letting the Soviets put nuclear missiles in there. And what he did, and it was quite remarkable, was he set up a blockade around Cuba so that when the ships were coming in, they would be searched. And if they had nuclear materials on board, they would be sent back. This was a lot better than what the military was talking about doing and what the CIA wanted to do, were airstrikes. It was learned later that the nukes were already operational on the island. So if he had taken the Air Force or the CIA's advice, we'd all be living in a nuclear-fried world right now. So, and this can't be overestimated or overemphasized enough. Yes.
I've got such a great question here. Mirror 13. Could Jack Hemingway have been broken by the Nazis while prisoner and was then asked to join the CIA by the CIA's post-war Nazi infiltrators rather than the white coat CIA folks? I don't know if there are white coat CIA folks.
It's an excellent question. I did wonder what happened to Jack Hemingway when he was prisoner of war, but the Nazis had quite a few. Anyone who studies, when we get to the DeMohrenschildt part of tonight's show, there's going to be more Nazi stuff. And where's Dr. Farrell when you need him, right? Mm-hmm. But we have talked about how General Gehlen had an intelligence network for Nazi Germany. And when the United States and the Allies beat Nazi Germany, we took Gehlen and his network and used it as the foundation for the Central Intelligence Agency, which is why so many bad players got in. And this was something that was set up by Allen Dulles, who Kennedy would eventually fire. And Dulles figures in tonight as we go along. So we're gonna get to that more. But I do like the question. It's a very informed question, because when you get right down to it, when looking at the Central Intelligence Agency, look, this week they announced something that they are, as part of the national, basically intelligence authorization action that's going on. Every year, we have to announce, hey, there's $700 billion more for the military, which is ridiculous and larger than any other country by far. It should be half that, if anything. But in any case, this is what they do. And whenever they do this, there's so much money at stake that these little agencies like the CIA, with their plans, they put in requests and say, we want extra money for this, we want these little things, so that if anybody delays it and says, no, that's unconstitutional, whatever, they'll say, oh, you're holding up money for important, for the vets or whatever it happens to be. It's their very manipulative tactic. In fact, nobody has to delay any of the money. You just take the amendment out and pass it without it. It's very simple. So in this case, now this just happened in, I've been kind of putting it up on social media because Ron Paul identified it. And really went to town on it. I think he did a great job. But I've been reading it deeply. And what it is, basically, it is the no whistleblowers and sanctions on journalists. It's that aspect. And what they say, basically, their goal is to make sure that there are no more WikiLeaks in the future. Fundamentally, it's to stifle free speech and any criticism of the CIA, which already controls over 3/4 of the media anyway. So that has to be head off, and there has to be a major movement against that. They're trying to sneak it in as part of the authorization because of the budget that's involved. So you can see the Central Intelligence Agency is no champion of free speech. They're no champion of freedom or transparency. And when you hear these people trying to give the UFO file wholesale over to them through the TTSA and BS like that, now you know where they stand. They want to make sure that there are no more WikiLeaks. They want to sanction journalists. They want to put people in jail using the Espionage Act who mention what the CIA is up to. So they're trying to stifle that type of reporting. So when you get people that are in the UFO field talking about the UFO file, and they're cozying up with all the CIA people in the TTSA, just show them that and say like, oh yeah, the TTSA wants transparency, then why are they stifling here? This is the CIA, it's the same thing. You've got 12 members of the CIA and TTSA already at the very highest level. So, you know, you have to ask them those types of tough questions. Why, if the CIA wanted to give us the UFO file information, would they be stifling and threatening journalists and threatening to throw them into prison? I mean, it's ridiculous. Or whistleblowers. You're going to take a whistleblower now and say, well, there can't be any whistleblowers because WikiLeaks, you know, we've got Julian Assange and we can't ever let anybody get information out again. No, you know. The Central Intelligence Agency is an extra constitutional agency. It is not foreseen in the Constitution. It literally can be disbanded. All a president has to do with the stroke of a pen is get rid of it. Yes, a country needs a clandestine service. The military is more than capable of doing that. That's what Kennedy was trying to do. He was trying to move the clandestine service back to its branch, because when we go into the history of the Central Intelligence Agency, you know, it comes out of something called the OPC. And the OPC was this weird branch that went around kind of, you know, blowing up trains and fixing elections and things like that. And Truman, who was president at the time when the CIA was set up, said, hey, get that weird thing under this umbrella of CIA because I don't like what they're doing. They're running their own governments. And these guys were completely out of control. And instead, the people in the OPC wound up taking over the CIA. If you study the work of Professor Peter Dale Scott, you'll see that's what happened. And it continues to happen. And so when we see this stuff about the CIA is friendly now, and they just want to help you get UFO truth, no. I mean, what they want to do is they want to take people like Assange, who, by the way, they've been staking out for years, put him in prison, interrogate him, and not let any information come out. So let's be very clear about what the Central Intelligence Agency is all about. No fantasies. And, you know, just like it's the U.S. out of Syria, we see a lot of signs like that. Good. The CIA out of the UFO file. And definitely in terms of this national intelligence authorization, no way. No way. If that gets in there, then free speech and journalism would just be stifled straight up. Then that's a very big problem. So hopefully by bringing this kind of awareness to it, I thought Ron Paul did a great job. Look at Ron Paul, right? He's like about 85 years old, and he's in better shape than most of the people I meet every day. Just a totally incredible guy. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. We're getting deep into the hot zone, and we're kind of going through the lens of the major political battles that have taken place in the past to get some hint of what those battles are over and how that relates to land rising in the Atlantic Ocean now and the geopolitical situation heating up as a result of that. And I do think that Cuba in particular is right at the epicenter of the whole thing, along with Bimini, those two, with the Bahamas kind of straddling the middle of the situation. So one thing I want to mention, speaking of the clampdown and the CIA, is everyone that's getting thrown off of social media and all these different outlets. The way to get around that is to sign up for our newsletter. And the newsletter is at darkjournalist.com. Just go there, sign up for the newsletter, make sure it's a free newsletter. That keeps you and I on the same page. You'll get an update about once a week in your inbox with all the new episodes coming up and letting you know which guests are coming up and the special events that we have planned coming up for you in the fall. While you're there, subscribe, support the show. We've made it incredibly easy access, you might say, incredibly affordable. And this is a great time to get on board because of the special content for subscribers about the Hot Zone that is coming out shortly. So make sure that you do that. And this is definitely, like, the timing on that is perfect. Okay, so I am going to now jump deep, deep, deep into Dreyer. If you have anything, Miss Olivia, let me know.
A cult fan wanted me to ask you, could the just passed 9/11 Victims Fund be used for secret space funding?
Well, I think they have bigger ways and means than that. Certainly, if you have 21 trillion missing between HUD and the Pentagon, then that explains that. No, I think that 9/11 fund is a weird political football. It keeps going back and forth. And for my money, it's not enough money to be funding that, but it's an interesting idea. Okay, let's just get a hint of Dreyer from this obituary. Palm Beach, which is where he ended up after being in Haiti, Nigeria, Jamaica, Cuba, serving Hemingway, Johnson, these different administrations. Business. This is a business guy. Really a mover and a shaker. He comes from Rochester, New York. So you wonder, okay, his family had a certain business thing going on down there. How did this guy get recruited to work for the Central Intelligence Agency? And what's his connection with Hemingway? Well, oddly enough, although he meets Hemingway in the 50s in Cuba, after Hemingway is kind of estranged from his son a little bit, or I don't know if estranged is quite the word, but there's a barrier there because the son is with the Central Intelligence Agency and Hemingway is trying to keep very far away from that. So I think that they're getting the impression there, if Jack is giving information on Ernest, that this isn't going so well. And so they introduce kind of another son character. But interestingly enough, he comes along and he says, well, I was, Jack's best friend at Dartmouth, don't you know? Oddly enough, though, Hemingway had never met him. I found this very, very unusual. So I felt instantly that Dreyer was maybe a loose acquaintance of Jack Hemingway at Dartmouth. And then later they decided to use him to come into Hemingway's life. Especially when you start to realize the movers and the shakers around Dreyer. And although he's a very interesting guy, he's quite the opportunist. And he's a deep, deep CIA operator. Okay. But he was at Iwo Jima and he was a hero and all the rest. So they talk a little bit in his obituary about how he was shot in the chest. It was actually a dum-dum that exploded in his chest, and it should have gone through his heart and taken out his whole left side, but instead it hit his dog tags. So there was a miracle there right off the bat. Interestingly enough, Hemingway had a very similar miracle happen to him when he was an ambulance driver in World War I, and his ambulance got blown up, and he should have died, but he didn't. But it gave him a sense of the mystical because during the experience, he was outside of his body looking down at everything that was happening. So ever since then, he had this kind of dual worlds going on. So they go into this kind of bit about his past life. And then a few things really popped out for me. Let's get into some of it. In his cozy den, the walls are decorated with antique rifles and jaguar skin he purchased in Ecuador. Dreyer goes pages through a crumbling scrapbook of photos he and his battalion photographer shot during World War II. They did an interview with him before he died, so they ran it in his obituary. So he downplays all of the heroism he faced and being in the Marines at Iwo Jima and everything. And this was, I want to say, in all fairness to Dreyer, he seems like quite a remarkable character. It's just that he got kind of pulled into all this intelligence work, and with the deepest part of the JFK assassination, which is where generally people know him from, and his connections through that, to see him showing up with Hemingway is, let me tell you, very, very off the charts. He said, they're asking him, well, how did you get into this unusual thing of quinaf and growing quinaf in Cuba? This is exactly what the CIA set him up for.
Was it Cuba or was it Haiti?
Well, it wound up being Haiti, but he started it in Cuba. Mm-hmm. And he founded the North Atlantic Quinaf Corporation. We were doing some research on quinaf, and it's
basically a type of hemp.
Yeah, it's basically a kind of hemp. And there were so many things that Cuba's very good to grow. They had incredible sugar plantations and all the rest of it. It's one of the major things that they can do. In 1950, a civilian Dreyer. Now, this is after the war, and the CIA has enlisted him, but they don't advertise that very much in this article. A civilian Dreyer moved to Cuba and founded the North Atlantic KNAF Corporation with assistance from the United States Agency for International Development. That's AID, which is a CIA front. Now, KNAF is a fiber similar to jute that can be used to make sugar, coffee, sand, bags, twine, carpet. So like we said, it's very much like hemp. At the end of World War II, says Dreyer, for my age group, it was either go north, young man, to Alaska, or go south to Latin America. And so it was go south, no question about it. Cuba was an absolutely wonderful place to live. One day in Havana, and watch the story closely. One day in Havana, Dreyer recognizes Ernest Hemingway sitting in the corner of a bar. What do you know? I went up and introduced myself, telling him that I had several of his rifles and shotguns given to me in 1943 by his eldest son, Jack. Now remember, he's supposed to be his best friend at college, but even by 1943, and he's giving him all these rifles and stuff, the elder Hemingway has never met him, never heard of this guy till he met him in a bar in Cuba. Jack was one of my best friends at Dartmouth, says Dreyer. Hemingway took Dreyer under his wing and treated him like a member of his family. In fact, he did. He treated him like a son. He was wonderful, Dreyer says. All the time we spent with him, days and nights, an awful lot of martinis, but I never heard him use a foul word. It's hard to believe somehow. So Dreyer gets married, and the key, the kind of trick to all this is that Hemingway shows up at Dreyer's wedding, and we have this. This is what kicked off this search for all these details about Dreyer's association with Hemingway, which we're still sifting through. The material has been out there, even in this obituary, it's been mentioned, but it has not been followed up by anyone in relation to these two characters. So the Dreyer's guest book includes Charles Adams, and when President John Kennedy visited and his family visited Palm Beach, Jackie Kennedy's secretary would stay with them. I found this very interesting because Jackie Kennedy's secretary is a really good pipeline into the White House and what's going on there. So this is somebody who can get a lot of intel working through the CIA, having these connections. So what happened is he flees Cuba when Castro gets in there, but he's been there 3 years with Hemingway, best buddies, very, very tight. After fleeing Cuba, Dreyer moved his KNAF operations to Haiti, a fascinating country with an amazing cast of characters. Now, it was very unstable environment because we had put in a dictator named Papadoc, a Duvalier, and he was running things. He got worse and worse with his civilian population, and he was running death squads, and anyone who objected to him, were disappeared in the night, and it was really had become quite a slave colony. Interestingly enough, we were using him as kind of an antidote to Castro, who was sucking up to the Russians and getting into that whole thing. But we were looking the other way with Papadoc's activities. And strangely enough, Papadoc takes a liking to our friend Dreyer and tries to get him involved in his activities. This all leads Dreyer to a very close association with someone else who's very well known if you study the intrigue around the JFK assassination, and that is this figure. His name is George DeMohrenschildt. DeMohrenschildt is an oil geologist and friends with, get ready for it, George Bush the first, because they're both in the oil business in Texas around the time of the Kennedy assassination. But in the 50s, the CIA is recruiting DeMohrenschildt to go to Haiti and places like that and see what's going on with Papadoc, and also to get a bank going and all these other things. And they're starting to get worried about Papadoc by the 60s, by the Kennedy era. And DeMohrenschildt is down there actually setting up another figure named Charles to take over for Papadoc. So this all gets very interesting, but let's stick just to the Dreyer narrative. Dreyer becomes very close friends with DeMohrenschildt. And DeMohrenschildt is saying that he's doing all this development work and all the rest of it, and Papadoc is falling for it. But DeMohrenschildt spends all this time down there in the hot zone. Now, I do want to say, just in case anyone doesn't know, that the person that DeMohrenschildt winds up becoming close to is Lee Harvey Oswald. DeMohrenschildt, after being in the hot zone, goes directly to Dallas, and he becomes part of the Dallas Petroleum Club, which is predominantly big Texas oil and a lot of CIA people. So when Oswald comes back from Russia, he tries to get into Cuba, supposedly looking for a visa to get into Cuba, and it doesn't happen. And so what happens instead is that there's a person who DeMohrenschildt identifies as J. Walton Moore, who was a major CIA recruiter. And he takes DeMohrenschildt aside and he says, I want you to do me a favor. See this guy who just came back from Russia? I want you to keep tabs on him, spend time with him, and all the rest of it. Now, DeMohrenschildt, being a very shady insider, working with these people, doesn't ask too many questions. And he goes and he starts to become a major figure, taking Oswald to parties, helping him get set up with his wife and kids, bringing over clothes, money, really helping along the way. And everyone, when they look back at this, says, well, what's going on here? Because DeMohrenschildt is an oil geologist. He hangs out with all these millionaires.
He's a very sophisticated person.
He is an incredibly cultured man. Mm-hmm. Why is he hanging out with $1.25 an hour Lee Harvey Oswald, who just got back from Russia and doesn't have any friends, supposedly, and is supposed to be somebody who's kind of like, a malcontent? I think what starts to become apparent is that he's grooming Oswald for something. Now, he himself, over the years, after the Kennedy assassination, he's brought before the Warren Commission, and he's the one who says, oh, yeah, Oswald, he was the one, he had a rifle and all this stuff. So most of the damning information comes from the Paynes, who Oswald was staying with his wife, and through DeMohrenschildt, who set him up with the job at the school book depository and all the rest of it. So he's very tight with this whole Texas elite setup. And what they're doing is they're kind of fattening up the Thanksgiving Day turkey with Oswald. Now, but it's getting unusual because if you look at Dreyer's life, he's arms round Hemingway on one side, and on the other side, he's arms round DeMohrenschildt. And he works with DeMohrenschildt in Haiti for years, trying to install this other dictator into Haiti. And then DeMohrenschildt, when he's back in America, here he is going through the motions of sort of helping this young guy out, Oswald, who in just a few months, now this is 1963 that he's doing this, in just a few months, DeMohrenschildt will become full-blown the person who helped out the assassin. And he will be taken before the Warren Commission, and he'll say, yeah, I'm sure Oswald did it. He had the rifle and all the rest of it. So that part of the story all plays out. DeMohrenschildt sort of played his role very well. If you look at the Warren Commission, you'll see that the longest testimony of any single person in the JFK assassination case was DeMohrenschildt. He gives over 100 pages of testimony. So he's the central figure, the linchpin to sink the case against Oswald, which, of course, Oswald was already dead, so there's no real actual legal case against him. So now we have DeMohrenschildt, we have Cuba, we have the JFK assassination, we have the Atlantis piece in the midst of it. Let's go back to JFK for a minute with Hemingway and see what was going on here. While I do that, Miss Olivia, take it away.
You're amazing. I don't know how you can keep all of it straight. This is what is so special about you, is that you
tell me why I'm special.
You are so special because you can hold so many dots. It's like juggling. You can hold so many balls in the air at one time and not lose track of them. And the rest of us lose track. I know I do. And I'm just waiting for you to kind of summarize it for me.
It is, yeah. Well, it's very interesting. To me, it feels like there's so much information coming out about this that wasn't available even 5 years ago. Mm-hmm. And so it's an explosion of information, but how are we going to make any sense of it? But thank you. Of course, everyone is always in awe of your ability of assembling things so well.
I'm a bottom line kind of girl.
Miss Olivia knows how to handle the chat.
Just Bottom line it for me.
Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist show. It's fantastic to have such a great crowd tonight, Friday night, July 26th, 2019. We are here with X-Steganography series, series episode number 61. And this is Operation Atlantis, which is launched in response to what's going on with the Central Intelligence Agency. We've already, right now in this episode, we've already shown that the CIA was trying to launch a war right near, right where the Bay of Pigs is, right near an underwater island. This whole thing is about islands rising. And so this, this is part of the breakthrough. Joseph Dreyer with Hemmingway is another major piece of history that's now coming to light that we didn't have even a little while ago, because so much about Dreyer has just been, even in his obituary, they're kind of overlooking. They're saying, oh, he's very, he likes intrigue and stuff. That means he went on these James Bond adventures for the CIA. And this is the nature of the thing. So, but I want to remind everyone who's watching the show to make sure that you go to Dark Journalists, sign up for our newsletter, and keep us in touch, especially at this crucial period that we see so much on the social media side. I had a conversation with Alexandra Bruce this week from Forbidden Knowledge TV and got the whole thing down about her battle with MailChimp. And this is just off the charts. And of course, you don't want to pick Alexandra as an adversary because she stayed on it. But that's a massive newsletter that she has. And they literally just didn't like the content that she was putting out there, which is ridiculous. I mean, you need a better reason than that, but apparently they didn't. But she's moved over now, and so much the better. But you can see that it's very easy to disrupt those communications. So my suggestion, make sure that you're signed up for the newsletter. 1, make sure that that's happening. And then 2, if you're a subscriber, even better, because then you don't have to chase around after YouTube hoping that we're up there. Okay.
May I ask a cut to the chase
of
question? Okay, Nancy J. Simpson wants to know, why did DeMohrenschildt commit suicide at age 65, or do you think he was murdered?
No, he was definitely murdered, but we're getting into that part of the story. So I think it's important when we look at DeMohrenschildt to understand that he's placed very unusually, because on one hand, in the 70s, there will be a lot of JFK assassination. They're starting to relook at it. They're starting to restrain the power of the CIA. You have things like the Church Committee, the Rockefeller Committee, the Pike Committee, and they're looking all into these aspects. Of course, Nelson Rockefeller has a great role with Dreyer as well. So the CIA is very out of fashion after Watergate, basically. And people starting to put it together, oh, you know what? They were involved in the JFK assassination. The things just aren't adding up. And people are finding out through testimony that the CIA hired the mob to do assassinations overseas. And they're starting to wonder, oh, they probably could hire them to do them here also, even though they're not supposed to operate on American soil, oddly enough. Clandestine agency, remember. So, we have a lot of committees and things. These committees finally get around to DeMohrenschildt, and it brings DeMohrenschildt and Dreyer together after some 15 some odd years that they haven't really dealt with each other. And they both were involved in very sticky things for the CIA in Haiti with Papa Doc, and in the 50s with Castro. Before Castro with Batista, and then by the time Castro gets in, they get thrown out, and the whole thing is about, can we get rid of Castro? The reason this is important, we're looking at it from 2 angles. So we're coming in from the geopolitical angle of all the struggles that we see and continue to see in relation to the hot zone. But then we're also coming in from this other angle, which is the Operation Atlantis, Atlantis rising, and keeping an eye on that. The reason that these forces are interested in that is because, again, if this island comes up, it can be claimed, and it represents a whole new territory. And if it's part of a theme of a bunch of islands rising, then it's a massive political problem. Also, the most important aspect is in the hot zone is the technology, and both sides are aware of it, X-Protect and X-Share. They are aware of the fact that the mystery schools have a legacy, that this technology, this information was buried at some point. So that kind of, I think, gives us the focus of why these forces are at it. But I think the thing that we've brought forward that's unique to this is that the major figures that are involved, JFK, Hemingway, up until the time we mentioned it, I don't think anyone really brought forward the idea that Hemingway was interested in Atlantis, or that JFK had gone to such great lengths to get Hemingway's material out of Cuba by having basically almost a national security incident and smuggling it out with a shrimp boat. Now we see things on the ground like the JFK Library and the massive Ernest Hemingway exhibit that they have there. And a lot of people look at that and go, huh. But they're not going, huh, if they're watching this show, because it's starting to, those things are starting, I would say, to come together. Yes, Miss Livia. Okay, yeah.
So,
I want to mention this before anything. We're going to take questions in the second part of the program, which is coming up pretty fast here. Ask the questions all in caps, and we're just going to run through them there in the second half of the program. Olivia's going to put them together, but definitely ask the questions in caps because it's easier to keep track of. Yes.
I was just laughing because Alistair Barker said, DJ is good with moving balls, random dots, and disconnected random calls, but can he cook scrambled eggs? He's got to have some flaws. And I was just commenting that you were excellent at making omelets.
Oh, that's true. That's true.
You're the best.
Yeah, my dad was an excellent cook, and he gave me a few things on that side. I don't have enough time to actually do it, so most of the time I'm eating on the run. But definitely, omelets would definitely be a specialty. Okay.
Okay, can I just get an actual real question?
Yes, you can.
Okay, El Cid Barrett wants to know, does DJ think the
I'll
underwater...
tell you what we'll do is we'll have a food section a little bit later. Okay.
Do you think the underwater ruins are subterfuge to obfuscate USN underwater bases near Cuba?
Do I think they're subterfuge? No, I mean, they're actually there. So they could be used. I think what's happening predominantly is even the way that they were discovered the second time around when Castro hired Paulina Zalitsky. He said it was under the guise of, oh, go find those Spanish galleons. I know you can do it. And she found these incredible cities instead. And then when she got to a certain point with it and even got it out to the media, they couldn't block it because it was a Cuban story. So instead, they got on board with it for a little while. And then after a while, they were like, oh, it's probably just some leftover structure from the Bay of Pigs invasion of Cuba, So they took this route with it. And then the Cuban Navy was the one who told her, hey, no more of that story. And she had a series of issues. And the work that she did, Paulina, in discovering the city, I think gives us all pause because it's an incredible place. And it's an incredible piece of work, probably the best ruins that have been found underwater. And these are very clearly pyramid structures. And these were probably temples at one point. This is a very hot potato in the hot zone because the problem is if you have an advanced culture city discovered underground, and the way that she described it is if you're using kind of satellite imagery, this thing looks like a metropolitan city. So you're talking about an advanced city underwater. That changes everything. It changes our history. It gets into this advanced technology. It's like finding ancient Egypt underwater, and Cuba has it. It's in their waters. We can't get at it. So they decide, okay, Zalitsky knows enough. Get her off the scene, basically. And she goes through all these other problems where she's actually put in a Mexican jail at one point. And, because she's in Canada, she's defected from Cuba to Canada. So there are all these issues, I think, in relation to the hot zone that when you start to look at it, you can see what a big problem it is for the forces that are trying to control the situation. In the previous episode, we brought up that Martin Luther King had spent time on Bimini. Well, it adds that to the long list of fascinating figures associated with Bimini because Bimini is a very small island. Why are these figures associated with it? Martin Luther King spent a lot of time there, and as a matter of fact, he was there writing his final speech before he was shot in Memphis. So I do feel that we're starting to see these major figures associated with this Atlantis story if we can look back with the correct amount of hindsight. In going further into the story, I found out that guess who else spent a whole lot of time on Bimini? Richard Nixon. Okay, President Nixon. Think about that.
You didn't tell me that.
I know. Well, I'm working on something separately, but I'm going to let that part of it out. Nixon on Bimini. Okay, so we have Ernest Hemingway and his strange association with the Caseys, and Casey saying Bimini's, Atlantis rising, and then we have Martin Luther King there, and now we have President Nixon spending all this time on Bimini. I mean, there's lots of other islands down there. In the 60s. Okay. Yeah.
So what was he doing? Was he vice president at that point, or was he in New York as a lawyer?
Yeah.
What era was this?
And he lost to Kennedy in 1960. He was the vice president for Eisenhower at the time. And Nixon went into kind of a weird political oblivion for a while. And he just went back to being a Wall Street lawyer in New York. But in 68, he ran, and then through his tight association with Howard Hughes, he got in there through the assassination of Robert Kennedy, who was poised to beat him. So this is the way that 68 played out. As it turns out, when you look at Nixon, it's very fascinating because, there's somebody who knew an intense amount about the UFO file and who was part of CIA Blue Book, not the phony Blue Book that is spilled out for the public. So we have someone quite remarkable with Nixon. The idea of him spending time in the hot zone, we know through the episodes we've done about the time capsule, so many unusual things, like Gene Dixon being his main advisor, this major psychic. And we're going to find a major psychic in this story, too, associated with DeMohrenschildt, of all people. And that's Gerald Crozet, who's a very unusual clairvoyant, and we're going to get into him as well. A couple of quick pictures to orient us around here. Fantastic. By the way, keep the questions coming because they're fantastic. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalists program. And
I'm going to vent for a second.
Oh, yeah.
Don't think that you can come into my chat and diss DJ.
Uh-oh. Who dissed me?
It doesn't matter. They're removed. But you got some nerve, and you're just removed.
Well, listen, I'll tell you something that's interesting is you got some blue chickens out there.
Yeah.
That's just the way it's going to roll. And then now you have the TTSA, so it's going to work that way. But no, we don't have a glass jaw, and we definitely will take.
Yeah, and it's all I can do not to swear. Sorry.
Do not. Let me tell you, Olivia's kung fu is hardcore, so do not inflame the Olivia. Okay. But thank you very much for taking care of that. And yeah, keep the chat clean. Of course, the chat is the ideas room, and we have so many incredible people in there that when somebody comes in who is, very obviously from one of these groups out there, then it is, I used to have a line on this, which is pretty good, which is if you're someone from a 3-letter agency who's going to use 4-letter words, you've just met a 5-star spam general. But you're watching the Dark Journalist show. I'll tell you one thing, though. I can remember when they were running those intense, weird porn bots. And that was we figured out a way around that, thank God. So it is, when you're out there, you're doing it. You're making it happen. Okay. So we're moving right along. Who is that with President Kennedy? After Hemingway's death, that is Mary Hemingway, who he will get together with to figure out a very unusual operation, shall we say, to get Ernest Hemingway's vault out of Cuba. The vault was at his villa, and when the revolution took over, there were so many things that happened there that they seized it. And it became a flashpoint. Now, a document came out in 2015, and it was, as I've mentioned on this program, that JFK with RFK, the head of the Central Intelligence Agency, and Edward Lansdale, who kind of went between the Air Force and Secret Ops for CIA, they're all sitting there discussing this national security incident that is to take place at Hemingway's villa. Hemingway doesn't live there anymore. The Cubans have it. But there's a vault in his residence, and apparently the Cubans can't get into it. So what happens instead is that they talk deeply about how to do this. Now, when they've taken this paper to major Kennedy historians, like Arthur Schlesinger, for example, he says, I have no idea what op it is they're talking about. This is the piece, this is the shred of evidence that we have. Something was happening in relation to the JFK's administration and Hemingway's estate. And I believe one of the things that I said earlier about John F. Kennedy is he was good at putting these messages out through back channels. And we remember that when President Kennedy was assassinated, Castro was sitting with a journalist who was a back channel for Kennedy, saying, and they were introducing a new policy through this journalist, not through an ambassador or somebody official, but he had all these unofficial contacts going on. And that's a crucial thing to remember with Kennedy when we look at the Hemingway story. Kennedy, when he's dealing with these issues, what he does is he writes letters in public. When we go through the records now, we found a series of different letters that he wrote in relation to this. This is one of them. I'm not going to show too many, but this is his draft for this letter that he's writing to Hemingway. We don't have the actual letter, but we have 6 pages of a draft. Interestingly enough, it's literally called in the corner there, Letter to Hemingway. It's all in JFK's handwriting, and they even have it at the JFK Library now. It's vindicated as him writing it in 1946. He wrote a 6-page letter to Hemingway, and it mentions all these things about young people, the military, world power, where things are going. You know, it's quite a kind of a geopolitical, let's look at the condition of the world letter. Next, here is July 26, 1955, Kennedy writing on the record to Ernest Hemingway and saying, Dear Mr. Hemingway, I'm completing a book on political courage and the stories of senators who risked their careers for speaking out for principles which were extremely unpopular among their constituents. I'm most anxious to use in the text a definition of courage as grace under pressure, which was attributed to you. And he goes into this whole thing about grace under pressure. In fact, when Kennedy puts out profiles in courage, the first thing is, it's the Hemingway quote. That's what he opens it with. I think that these messages publicly are the kind of subtle communicating about the project and where Hemingway is, because we're going to find unusual links between Hemingway and JFK as we have in the program. But I want to reiterate a couple of them, and then we're going to get into the Hemingway Dreyer debacle, and then we'll take your questions. Okay, so this one is as soon as Kennedy gets in, he writes a telegram to Ernest Hemingway, and it says, during our forthcoming administration, we hope to seek a productive relationship with writers, artists, composers, and philosophers in science and head of cultural institutions as a beginning and recognition of their importance. I want to extend to you our most cordial invitation to attend the inaugural ceremonies in Washington on January 19th and 20th. He wants him there in person. It proves to be too much for Hemingway, and he does not go. He says due to a health condition, he can't do it. So in the beginning, there's the quote from the beginning of the book. Now, interestingly enough, there's a figure who spent almost a decade with Hemingway when Hemingway was being a war correspondent. And during World War II, he had all these unusual activities. And this person tells really remarkable stories. But it turns out a person known as Mr. Walton in this picture here with JFK is, in fact, the same person who was passing messages in the background for Kennedy. He's the one who spent 10 years with Hemingway. For me, he's the perfect channel for going back and forth and giving messages between these two people. He muses about a very interesting story when during the Spanish Civil War. Hemingway was over there covering it as a journalist, and he's in a car with him, and he's talking all about it, and suddenly Hemingway grabs him by the tie and says, "Stop this car, stop this car." And he's like, "What are you talking about? We're going too fast." And he's like, "Jump out now, jump out." And they jump out and they roll down this hill. And the guy is completely freaked out because Hemingway has grabbed him and dragged him out of this car. And as it turns out, the car was hit by a shell as soon as they got out of it. And so he said, "How did you know?" And Hemingway said, "This happens to me." So interestingly enough, we have Hemingway with his mother's connection with Casey, and Casey's psychic work for the family. Now we have Hemingway exhibiting actual psychic ability, taking this guy out of harm's way. But again, here's Kennedy working with him and taking matters into his own hands, using him as a back channel. I think that's a crucial piece when we look at it, because we have to start to wonder, how did these guys communicate? On the record, they have communicated back and forth rather extensively. Now, Hemingway returned the favor, and he did this whole bit about talking about President Kennedy when he came into office and how much faith he had in him and all the rest of it. So they're making these public statements about each other back and forth. For me, Operation Atlantis is something where we have Hemingway, who spent time in Bimini, and he spent time in Cuba. In Bimini, he spends all this time going back and forth, looking underwater, and everyone wonders, what are you looking for underwater? And those types of answers are never forthcoming. Let's take a look at what they may have been looking for. And again, I think it's important when they discover the Bimini Wall, and we see those ruins. These ruins are, they extend around Bimini, and they are very clearly man-made, but you can see it's very easy to dive over them. It's actually only in 15 feet of water. So what they were looking for was the track of where these ruins were. And one of the reasons that we have Ernest's brother getting into this whole thing about finding ruins off of Cuba is because he's coming in on a plane to Cuba, and he sees the ruins that eventually Zalitsky will discover off the western tip of Cuba, and that is San Antonio. Now, just to make things very interesting and go even deeper, we have the family of a very noted scientist going in there and saying, well, he spent all this time down there, and this is Thomas Townsend Brown. And the family says, we thought he was spending time in San Antonio, Texas. But we realize it's literally decades of time him going to Cuba. And we know from just doing a quick recap on his life that he spent all this time in Cuba. When he first got there, they were testing early submarines. So he was already engaged in this process, and he met a very unusual millionaire who in his yacht had this unusual version of Alice in Wonderland, which he kept in this glass case that if the ship ever sank, the case would float, and that original version would be safe. I've mentioned this, that in fact, President Coolidge, hearing about it, said, bring me that copy of the original Alice in Wonderland, please. So those people, they quite understand the nature of how these things are important. For our purposes, we have to start to understand, why is Cuba and why is Bimini important? Why do we have so much attention on Cuba? Why do we have Nixon and MLK and Hemingway in Bimini? Why did Casey pinpoint Bimini as Poseidia? Obviously, there's something very powerful about where that is, because it's a very small strip of land. And if you look at it from overhead, it literally, again, as 7 miles, looks like a little blip. Most of the other islands are much more substantial. So it's quite a mystery. And so it really caps off that piece of the hot zone on that end. Now, again, just to reiterate the point about the hot zone, if we look at the people who've come forward to me and others and said, I was doing mapping of the ocean floor, and it turns out that when I was doing that mapping of the ocean floor, if I see anything, I can't report it. And they call certain areas under there the hot zone. Now, if this is what's going on, then the people who do have a right to be there, for example, the military and others, are all kind of facing off against each other underwater, trying to get a handle on this thing. We pointed out how Autec is right in Andros, which is right across from Bimini, and that's basically underwater Area 51. So we have to get a better handle, a new vision of this, and we start to take that vision and look back. We look forward and we look backward. We look backward to see that panorama of history and things that have played out there in a new light. And we start to understand why there's so much tension about it and how it goes beyond just normal geopolitical tensions. Certainly areas like that, we found out that Haiti was run for drug running for the CIA and all the rest of it. Fine, they've always had those types of things. But to risk, World War III, for example, it's obviously very important to them. Let's put it that way. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist Show. It's a fantastic crowd tonight. We really, we're getting some good questions away. We're going to get into questions now for the second half of the program, but I want to give us a little more on Dreyer and George DeMohrenschildt. How are we doing over there, Miss Olivia?
Good. I have to say, I let my temper. I'm still trying to calm down a little bit.
I think it's the power of the green juice over there. That's what's doing it. Come on.
The damn spirulina.
You can't drive 65.
So, Alexandra from Forbidden Knowledge TV put out a newsletter talking this week, talking about Epstein being the keystone, the connecting figure between all these other figures. It's amazing. And wouldn't you say that DeMohrenschildt is the keystone of this era that you're going into, the hot zone? He is connected to almost everybody back then. Who's anybody?
It's really amazing.
Player.
Yeah, actually, it's a good term for him. I like that a lot. Well, I mean, we have to think about DeMohrenschildt. What's odd is that he dated Jackie O's mother in the late 30s. How strange is that? So, he was dating a Bouvier before any of this Kennedy stuff happened. And also, he was interrogated by the CIA. He was interrogated, and I think that's how they got him to join, actually. But originally, people thought he was a Nazi spy, even though he came from Russia. And his whole family, I won't get too much into his background, but his whole family were the kind of wealthy people, what they call White Russians, who were very big before the 1917 revolution. They had that kind of power. And the White Russians are the ones who wanted things to go back the way they were under the czars and didn't want all of this communism stuff. So it's a very interesting intrigue. Most of those people wind up in America, and in the 60s, in the early 60s, they're in Dallas. And this is the arm when Oswald comes back with Marina from Russia. And, he has a Russian wife, which is very hard to get a Russian wife into this country back then. And then who shows up to help him with everything like an angel is DeMohrenschildt. So I think we have to look a little bit deeper with those types of connections. And you see this incredible, sophisticated guy who rubs shoulders with millionaires hanging out with Oswald before they set him up as the patsy. That gets us very deep. Let's look at this situation. Before he is taken out, suicided, DeMohrenschildt, 1977, gets a subpoena to appear in front of the House Assassinations Committee, and they want to question him about Oswald and all these other things. So some very unusual things take place. But one of the things that happens is that Dreyer gets a call, Joseph Dreyer, who we started the program with, gets a call from George DeMohrenschildt, and he says, I have something very important to tell you. And Dreyer says, well, that's excellent. I want to hear all about it. I'll tell you what. Let's meet at this mansion that you're staying in 2 days. And DeMohrenschildt is really pressing him. We got to meet. And Dreyer's like, well, that's what we'll do. And that's what happens. But instead, the following day, DeMohrenschildt is supposed to have this meeting with Edward Epstein. He's already met him for one journalistic thing where he's exposed a lot about the JFK assassination players. And so he's found in a pool of blood with this rifle. And I covered his story in a documentary called Agent Oswald that's still up there that I did for YouTube maybe like 4 years ago. But if you want to get a little bit deeper on that aspect. But let's look a little bit at what's on the record here, because he writes a note to George Bush, who, remember, was his friend back in the 60s during the oil years during the Kennedy assassination. But this is the 70s, and now our friend DeMohrenschildt is writing to him as CIA director, because in 76, Bush is CIA director. And he says, I'm being surrounded by these strange things. These groups are following me. My phones are tapped. I'm getting electronically harassed. Please help me. Tried to write stupidly and unsuccessfully about Lee Harvey Oswald, and I must have angered a lot of people. Please basically call the dogs off. And so the letter becomes public. So Bush has no choice but to actually respond to it. And so George Bush responded and said, let me say first that I know it must have been difficult for you to seek my help in the situation outlined in your letter. I'm extremely sorry to hear of these circumstances in your situation. I can well imagine how the attentions you described in your letter, getting gang stalked and electronic harassment, the attentions, I can well imagine how the attentions you described in your letter affect both you and your wife. However, my staff has been unable to find any indication of interest in your activities on the part of the federal authorities in recent years. I can only speculate that you may have become newsworthy again in view of the renewed interest in the Kennedy assassination, and thus may be attracting the attention of people in the media. I hope this letter is of some comfort to you, George, first name basis, although I realize I'm unable to answer your question completely. So DeMohrenschildt literally reaches out to Bush and says, help me. The CIA is after me. You're the head of it. Get rid of these dogs. And he goads him into responding publicly. And so basically that's kind of like a form letter from George Bush. But let's just take in this panorama for a second. DeMohrenschildt, being the close friend and promoter of Lee Harvey Oswald and helping him out when he comes back from Russia, good friends with George Bush, and then being called before the House Assassinations Committee, writing this letter to Bush saying, help me, and then getting killed. It gets very, very heavy when you look at those connections. What in the world, how could anyone ever think that someone like Oswald would be connected with this branch of power? And yet he is. This is what has to be remembered and maintained. All of the stories, all of the fictions that we've been sold over the years in relation to these people from the media are a complete joke. If you watch a lot of the Kennedy specials about his assassination, they'll all be like, who was it who ordered the bubble top off? And like, was his head snapping back when it happened? All this junk about it. When you have the leader of the Central Intelligence Agency best friends with somebody who's befriending Oswald, that's the story. And this is the way that the Central Intelligence Agency has been able to keep these stories under wraps. And it's quite remarkable, but it's not even over yet, because Dreyer, having had this association with DeMohrenschildt, it gets to some investigators on that House Assassinations Committee, and they say, you've been with them for quite a while. You knew this guy for years. Let's get you in front of our committee. Since this guy just got blown away, let's talk to you, Dreyer. And remember that Dreyer, his best friend there for years in Cuba, and at Dartmouth, and then in Cuba and hanging out with his dad, was Jack Hemingway, who's spotted here with his daughter, Mariel, and Margot and Muffet. And the daughters there, of course, would become under intense pressure as a result of the secret that this family has in relation to the work that was being done by the Kennedy administration for this Operation Atlantis, as I'm dubbing it here. But those families were under unusual pressure. They were thrust into the public spotlight. They were made sort of megastars. And in the case of Margot, her entire life was destroyed. And she committed suicide at a very young age. Now, what's interesting also is that Les Hemingway committed suicide at a very young age. Well, not at a very young age. He was in his 60s, but it's still very unusual considering the person that he was. And remember what he was doing at the end of his life? Well, he was all about this Bimini well and finding out how the Atlanteans built this Bimini well. So that family has really been through it. Les's daughter, as I've pointed out, wrote these books, Dream Child, which all take place around the Bahamas and are all about these alien contactees. And they studied alien contactees for 8 years. That's a long time. So they're incredibly vested. What we have to understand about the Hemingways is there are deep strands that connect them to this story of Atlantis and JFK and all the rest of it. But now we can see that right up front when we have JFK going out of his way to save all of this vault of Hemingways out of Cuba and risking a national security incident. So you have to wonder, none of this has ever been explained, by the way, at all. There's actually been no questions about it. And if you inquire to the Kennedy Library and Museum, very often what they'll say is, yeah, we get those questions a lot because people want to know, why is there this overhang of Kennedy and Hemingway? And the reason, obviously, is that they represent this branch of ex-share, which is more about getting the information out, more about informing the public, giving them their history. And we know in the case of Kennedy, giving them the truth about the UFO file, or at least giving these other countries that advantage. Now, we have to say about Jack Hemingway that he sort of gave in to the more brutal side of working for the CIA. He retired very early, by the way, at the age of 42 in 1967. How many people do you know who retire at 42? It's very interesting to me. And that's what an intelligence person can do, because then they can use you for different operations over time. And I remember Mariel in a documentary, Running from Crazy, just talking so much about the unusual attributes of Jack and how he had actually molested the older sisters, but not her, because of her close relationship with her mother. But we get some insight there that the twisting that was going on with Jack Hemingway through being associated with the CIA and through being in this strange world, the heavy duty manipulation to try to get information about what Hemingway was doing in relation to Kennedy, and how the CIA seems like they had a really hard time getting their hands on that. Now, at the end of Hemingway's life, he had some electroshock therapy. And oddly enough, at the end of Hemingway's, DeMohrenschildt's life, he also had electroshock therapy. So it seems like they got them into this program to kind of make them pliable, to give them answers. That's the way that I look at that. But everyone who knew Hemingway in that period said that he was constantly talking about the CIA probing his activities. Why were they so damn interested in Hemingway at that point? He was already back in America. They wanted the key to this information that he had in this vault. They may have been also interested in him for his Cuban, for his intelligence activities. But certainly it goes way beyond the bounds that they were still looking for this. And then by the time you get to Jack and his own dysfunctional treatment, and then his daughters become these megastars and face all these problems, you can start to see that pattern right underneath there if you're looking for it. And so many of the answers lie in the HotZone and the fact that the Caseys and the Hemingways had this relationship going on. This is what I think needs to be looked at. And it is that marriage of those two worlds that's going to give us these answers. Some of those answers we put on the record tonight aren't anywhere. And so we're just opening this up as we speak. Miss Olivia.
I'm amazed. So Shamanist Anamkara says, I was in the same meditation group with Margot Hemingway in the early 90s.
Oh, wow.
Wow.
Well, she had become like a psychic healer. And that must have been quite a remarkable experience. It's interesting, too, because, I see Gigi out there. When I asked Gigi about Margot and Mariel, she did sense that they had advanced psychic abilities as well. So with that, I have a few more things to show on this tip. But with that, Miss Olivia, I'm going to turn it over to you and your questions.
Okay. So Shamanist Anamkara again. So do we then feel Ernest Hemingway was suicided and did not take his own life? Maybe these Hemingways really didn't kill themselves, but were taken out.
Yeah, I mean, there's also a way to kind of make someone commit suicide. We know they have things like voice to skull technology now, but they had ways and means back then as well. So that's a factor. They can kind of make you do it by your own hand. I think in the case of Hemingway, the family has a background of this. It's very unusual because Ernest, his father, committed suicide after taking all of these records out of the basement and burning them on a table. So there's always a mystery around the Hemingways. We went deep into their history and found out that the original spelling of the name was Hemingway, which if you walk around Boston, you will see Hemingway Street over by the Symphony. There's an actual subway stop named Hemingway. And then they adjusted the spelling for it. What I found when I went a little bit deeper is one of their main ancestors was the first student at Yale. And his name was Hemingway, spelled that way. So they did eventually adjust the spelling, and it seems to me that there's a kind of idealism present in the family through the work of Muriel, who works around like suicide prevention issues and depression issues and things like that, and really has abandoned her entire Academy Award-winning Hollywood world as just a remarkable figure. But I think also in the case of Margot, she followed in the steps of Ernest Hemingway. She went to bullfights. She went to Spain. She went to France. She tried to live like he lived. So she certainly had this fascination for something there, like a deep family secret. And what Mariel says in the documentary Running from Crazy is they weren't allowed to talk about Ernest, which I think is completely off the charts. I mean, how can you not be allowed to talk about your famous grandfather? And just for people who like numerology, Mariel was born on November 22nd. Kennedy was assassinated on November 22nd. She was born in 61 and he died in 63, but that is kind of remarkable just on a coincidence level. Okay. Yes.
Okay. Najat wanted to know, have you contacted Mariel Hemingway, and would she ever come on the show?
I can't talk about that now.
Okay.
But I will say that the Hemingway family is very aware of the research and the shows that I've done on this.
Okay. M. Leland, does Mariel Hemingway admit that her family worked for the CIA?
Well, everyone knows that Jack was a CIA agent. As a matter of fact, the CIA themselves have a whole page that's an ode to Jack on their website, so it's no secret. The thing is, the real secret there is that they were doing an op on Ernest when he was in Cuba, trying to get to whatever was in his vault. And that is why Kennedy wanted to do that, and did. He actually got the majority of it smuggled out through a shrimp boat and risked an international incident, and he cooked it up. I think when I cite the national security document that came out in 2015 with Lansdale and the Attorney General on it, when they're talking about Hemingway's villa and a national security incident that can take place there, and none of the historians will comment on what that is, it literally is because they don't know, they would not know about Operation Atlantis. It's not something they would look into. But I think what's interesting is there's a big gap right there, because that's an actual bona fide document. Nobody can deny the document. It's released through FOIA. And it has them talking about this incident. Why would they be using Hemingway's villa for a national security incident? So it begs the question. And there's always question. There's a massive article that I cited from the Smithsonian, which is all about them getting this incredible information out of Hemingway's villa. So my kind of surmise of the whole situation is that Hemingway was working with groups that were taking pictures and were surveilling the hot zone looking for these things, and they were giving that back to this branch of intelligence, and definitely through the Kennedy administration.
This isn't a question, but I want to read it.
Yeah.
So
absolutely.
Aether says, with all the connections between JFK and Mr. Hemingway, I can't help but wonder truthfully if perhaps they were both actually related to each other in a previous lifetime.
Well, that goes...
Or a previous life timeline. Interesting.
I'll tell you what's interesting about that is that when Casey gives the reading for Hemingway's mother, Grace, he finds remarkable things about her background, including that she knew John the Baptist and things like that. And she was incredibly religious. But what he finds out about Hemingway, Ernest Hemingway, is that he was some kind of a spiritual leader in Egypt. So there is that hint there. They never go deeper than that in public, but we do get that hint that he's associated with Egypt somehow. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. We're taking your questions now on this incredible Operation Atlantis, JFK, CIA, and the Ernest Hemingway mystery. I wanted to put a couple of things on the record before we go any further. This is from a great book by Joan Mellon, and anyone who follows JFK information or intrigue around foreign policy is definitely into her work. But she knows a great deal about DeMohrenschildt, and so there's a couple of quick things that I think are important that she had in here. Now, there's this whole thing about how the CIA used DeMohrenschildt before he was working and shepherding Lee Harvey Oswald to become the patsy and accused of the assassination of John F. Kennedy. And what they did after they plucked him out of Cuba and Haiti is they actually put him on this beat of protecting this unusual mafia person. And the mafia person eventually would spill in court that he was actually giving information about the CIA. But what I found interesting are a couple of unusual things from DeMohrenschildt's past, and then I'm going to get to it. Here's the first one. DeMohrenschildt gets grabbed by the FBI because he's taking pictures of military installations in Corpus Christi. They question him, and this is in the 40s, before he's a major figure doing all these things for the CIA. And he actually says that he wrote a book. He's talking to them now. This is their transcript. And it's called The Adventures of a Young Man. Later, he changed the title to Son of a Revolution. DeMohrenschildt's written English was substandard, and the book was never published. But DeMohrenschildt said to the FBI agents, I found this very interesting, that it was being published by Ernest Hemingway and his publisher. So right off the bat, when DeMohrenschildt gets rolling and when he's put on the spot, he uses Hemingway as a foil. And he says, it's Hemingway who's publishing it. I'm like a respectable person and all this stuff. That's an early indication. That's the kind of dot connecting that's very unusual. You want another one? Here's another one. When Lee Harvey Oswald goes to enter Albert Schweitzer College instead of going to Russia, and this is in Finland, he writes them a letter and he says, I'm a great writer. That's why I want to go to your college. He never had written anything. And he says, my favorite writer is Ernest Hemingway. Starting to sense a pattern here? Hemingway is this strange intelligence dot that they keep putting forward in this story. So that's something definitely for us to keep an eye on. Okay, hit me with another one.
Okay, so Kon-Tiki Man. So why did Mary Hemingway reach out to Hoover in 1964?
Well, Mary Hemingway, she reached out and talked to Kennedy. And Kennedy was the one, JFK actually worked out this whole thing with her in 1963, and actually 62 after Ernest died, to get this back. In terms of if she had contacts with Hoover, the thing that you're talking about there, I'm not sure that was anything too substantial. They may have questioned her about Ernest, and that may be why she talked to them, but it had nothing to do with the Cuban operation, apparently. It's not the FBI's beat. Yes.
Okay, Najat Madri. Who has all the letters between JFK and Hemingway? Are they in the JFK library?
Well, this is the thing. There's the 6-page letter that's in the JFK library, but on the other end, they're like, oh, we don't know if Ernest ever got it, etc. And I have a feeling that was a draft of a letter, but as I was saying, Kennedy had a way of hiding his communications, even with Khrushchev. He would give it to a reporter to stick in their newspaper under their arm and walk out of there, and then nobody would know his communications that were going on. This is kind of a very important way that he did it. And I cited the other example, which was when he when he was being assassinated, Castro was sitting down with a journalist who had come down there to talk Kennedy policy with him, but he wasn't a diplomat or anything. He was just using a back channel again. So I don't think we're going to find the correspondence between Kennedy and Ernest Hemingway beyond what I've shown. But I will also say this, that there are letters from Jack Hemingway to Ernest Hemingway, and like other letters that Jack Hemingway wrote that are at the Kennedy Library. And if you go in that room, you can't copy them. You can't take them with you. You can't take pictures of them. You can read them. You can memorize them, but you can't use them for any purpose. I think that gives you some idea of how important Jack's correspondence is. Yes, Ms.
Jardin du Luxembourg again. Okay, can DJ please expound upon Hemingway's role as a leader in Egypt? Are you saying he is a member of the Brotherhood of the Serpent?
On whose role?
Hemingway's role as a leader in Egypt in a past life.
Oh, very interesting. Well, I don't think that there's enough there to formulate what it was, but it was significant that basically what Casey was doing was he was saying, be patient with Ernest, because the relations between Ernest and Grace weren't that great at that point. And he was saying, be patient with him. Remember, he has this kind of burden of this past where he had this incredible spiritual role with the people, and it may not have gone so well, was the impression that I got. But it's all in how you interpret it. Now, what I think is interesting is that, there's a lot of traces of theosophy and mystery school influence around Hemingway right from the very beginning, because when he goes to Paris, the person who takes him in is Gertrude Stein and Alice B. Toklas. And Gertrude Stein is very advanced on William James. She knows about theosophy. She's big into the Gurdjieff work. So she talks about meeting with Hemingway and the conversations that they have. And Hemingway, actually, the question he wants to know is all about time and stopping time and going back in time. He's obsessed with time travel, basically. And she said when they would sit down to talk about it, he'd want to talk about two things over and over again: dimensions and time. He's a very deep character, and I think that's why he can give us this incredible literary legacy. But I do not feel that his mysticism is so well understood. It's different.
This is kind of an intriguing question. Walker Publications, wouldn't a spiritual Hemingway be more of a problem for the CIA than a physical Hemingway?
Yeah, they probably had a lot of problems with him and his family line. My guess is that family is very important. I can't prove it from a mystery school point of view. I can definitely suggest it, but I can certainly prove that the connection with the JFK aspect and with Operation Atlantis, it's obvious. I mean, now that we're finding out that there's an underwater island at the Bay of Pigs, it makes that whole thing look totally different as well. So I think as that land rises, a lot of these answers a lot of these questions get answered. I want to read to you real briefly a couple of things. Since I mentioned Gertrude Stein, by the way, this is, Kennedy, when he was at Harvard, he spent a lot of time with Gertrude Stein, who was a professor there. And when they found a lot of mementos and things that he kept a picture of Gertrude Stein among his effects. When he left the presidency, he carried this with him. So I think that's quite important. And the other thing, he has some other things here, but her picture and her signature are right there on that. And for me, that tells you that Gertrude Stein made quite an impression on him. For her to take such a heavy role with Hemingway, this is also what Kennedy wrote in relation to Hemingway's death. I'm going to write this into the record real quick. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. We're on X episode 61, and we're deep in the hot zone with Olivia, who is taking your questions here. And we're going to introduce a little bit more and take a few more questions. And the questions are fantastic tonight. You guys are doing a great job in the ideas room. And I see some great people out there. We'll shout out. David Donaway was doing some great stuff pre-chat. I remember that, pre-show chat. Okay, from President Kennedy. Few Americans have had a greater impact on the emotions and attitude of the American people than Ernest Hemingway. First, from his emergence as one of the bright literary stars in Paris during the 20s, as a chronicler of the lost generation which was to immortalize, he almost single-handedly transformed the literature and the ways of thought of men and women in every country of the world. When he began to write, the American artist had to look for a home on the left bank in Paris. Today, the United States is one of the great centers of art, although his journeys through the world to France, to Spain, and even to Africa made him one of the great citizens of the world. He ended life as he began it, in the heartland of America, to which he brought renown and from which he drew his art. It seems to me beyond a form letter. It's pretty deep. He's definitely signaling there how important he was. That's from July 2nd, 1961. And remember, with Hemingway and Castro, they had this very dynamic relationship also, where Castro said, without a farewell to arms, there would be no Cuban Revolution. It's what we used as the guidebook. And he said he knew of very few people that he respected more than Ernest Hemingway. So we have this incredible dynamic of two powerful leaders embracing this mystery that Hemingway represents, basically. And of course, they respect his incredible literary talents. But we can see that there's something deeper going on here, as we've shown. One quick thing I was very fortunate to find, because a lot of people have asked me about this one. Lester Hemingway, very interesting character and brother of Ernest Hemingway, founded New Atlantis, as I've shown on this program. And he got a lot in the Atlantic Ocean for this place that was rising. But here's an actual picture of him pointing to where he thinks it's going to rise in the hot zone. And it's interesting because he does wind up buying the land towards Jamaica. And he does have an incredible resemblance to his brother Ernest as well. But he winds up buying that lot near Jamaica and putting a barge out there. So he's really got it. And what they have here is it says, Ernest Hemingway was a tough act to follow. His younger brother Lester, above, showing the location of New Atlantis, tried to little avail. But he wound up doing some very interesting things by putting that New Atlantis on the chart so that we understood that this was the nature of the thing that was happening. And it is, in fact, New Atlantis. Remember, we did a show on July 4th all about Francis Bacon and New Atlantis. Yes, Miss Olivia.
I just wanted you to address this a little bit. Tessa1111 says, Cuban Revolution got corrupted. Did it start out with good intentions? Could you talk about what Cuba was like before the revolution?
Well, it was run by the mafia. I mean, it was basically another kind of puppet regime that the United States had installed. And Cuba had a long history with us that was problematic, all the way back to slave trading and all the rest of it. Now, in Haiti, they had a slave revolution, of course, but in Cuba, the situation degenerated by the 50s, so that Batista was running things with, incredible casinos, and the mafia was involved. And the only good thing for the United States is that the Russians didn't have it. The problem with the Cuban Revolution, and this was an incredible period of revolution going on there. You had Che Guevara, and you had all of these different things happening. And we had overthrown the Guatemalan regime through a CIA overthrow. So, all these things that were happening with our Benz and all the rest of it. So it became something of U.S. business interests basically pushing their weight around and giving us a terrible reputation there for years to come. Now, when Castro got in, Castro's actually a lawyer. He likes to wear the fatigues and he liked to do the I'm a common man thing. He was raised in an incredible environment, and he comes from a very wealthy family. And he was able to create that revolution. People have always wondered where that financing came from. There's always been a lot of unanswered questions about how Castro rose to this position. And originally, remember, he came over here in 1959 and he spoke with Vice President Nixon, and he would talk to the UN, and he hung out in New York City and all this stuff. And then he went back to the island, and they found out, oh, he's cozying up to Khrushchev, and that's when all the sanctions started. So once they realized he wasn't going to be one of ours, and he did, I think, a stupid thing too, cozying up to Khrushchev. But at the same time, as soon as he did that, and probably before, the CIA just wanted to eliminate him. So they hatched a number of plans to assassinate him. That's a fact. And the Kennedys were not on board with this. So the CIA started to act on their own to do this. And one of the interesting stories that I think comes out is that Nixon wanted Howard Hughes, who he knew could create his own kind of paramilitary force, to work with the CIA to take out Castro before the 1960 election so he could win over Kennedy. And it didn't happen. So, Cuba's always been an incredible political football down there, but I happen to think that it's for more reasons than just the given reasons of it being a communist-run island. I think that those people understand the power of what's involved with the hot zone. Look, they might also be looking for other things like gold, like oil, but there's certainly a deep piece of this is the Operation Atlantis part. Yes.
James Curtis has a cute question. Do you believe that Hemingway was King Tut's dad, the lost pharaoh?
Listen, if Casey said that he was, in Egypt as a major figure, then I think that's important. I wish that he had done a full public reading for Hemingway, but he did so much. There's so much correspondence between him and Grace Hemingway. If you want, that's a tight connection with the Caseys and Hemingway. It's no accident that we have Hemingway in Bimini. Come on, why are you going to be in Bimini? By the way, it's no accident that McAfee is hanging out at Hemingway's pad when he goes to Cuba, and then he gets boarded a few days later. Keep that in mind too.
Okay, since you brought up McAfee, there's some, Marco Zerpa says, John McAfee has reemerged on Twitter after going dark online following what he said was a run-in with the CIA. John McAfee has threatened to bury the U.S. government if they keep harassing him over unpaid taxes, promising to leak a huge trove of files, proving corruption throughout Washington and its allies. How up to date are you on it?
Oh yeah. I've been watching the tweets very closely and corresponding with someone keeping a very close eye on the entire situation. Here's what I would say in relation to this. McAfee is the kind of guy who would get that type of intelligence. He does have this kind of background, this sort of, he's been a real troublemaker at times. And I'm not saying that, I can't speak to anything about his activities. What I will say is that his presence in the hot zone is quite important. And the fact that he got boarded and grabbed, and that he was trying to start a cryptocurrency revolution in Cuba, making Cuba self-sufficient while they have those ruins and all the rest of it. For me, it's very significant he's down there. There's no question about it. I'm watching it very closely. And I think the fact that he wants to run for president in 2020 to make a statement, I don't think that he thinks he can assume the presidency, but to make the statement for his cause, which is apparently libertarian from what I understand, it's very interesting that they grabbed him. Usually they would probably give him time and surveil him. They grabbed him pretty quick.
Why do you think he's bothering? I mean, I think he's financially independent. Why not just go off into the sunset, enjoy retirement on his yacht?
Yeah, and he's known for some very unusual activities, right? He's sort of a kind of a wild playboy in a lot of ways. But I think he makes some good points just in general about the corporate takeover of technology. One of the things he came out with was that your phone was spying on you. And he went into great detail about it. That type of stuff is important. He comes from the tech world. I remember very well when I worked in the technology world that, McAfee antivirus was the thing that he used for the Mac. It was a major company. So my feeling is that with that kind of money, like $100 million, whatever you're saying, this is obviously somebody who wants to make a mark, a statement. And Some people could just say that it's grandstanding and he has a big ego and all the rest of it. Could very well be true. But if he's standing in Hemingway's villa and he's getting grabbed in Cuba while he's in the hot zone, for me, it's pretty damn interesting.
This is and Mermaid Moxie says, I think McAfee is the one who made the clear drone footage of Pedo Island.
Whoa.
Wouldn't that be interesting? What a good theory.
That
It's
is
juicy.
interesting. I know people, yeah, and some people try to roll him in with Epstein and all the rest of it. I don't know how much substantial information there is on this guy, except that he got busted in Belize, and then he was interrogated for 12 days, but they let him go, and they were like, well, he didn't do anything wrong. It wasn't like a drug bust or anything else. I think that they're nervous about him. In a way, he's a little bit of a bull in a china shop down there, and that could be dangerous if he catches on to what's happening. I want to point this out, too, which is Mariel has made frequent visits down there to Cuba as well. And she did, with the Today Show, recently go down to Hemingway's villa and, kind of walk and talk through it all. And I think that she's someone who's a very important figure in all this because she lived under the weird repression of not being able to talk about Ernest, and so she can communicate some of that angst about the whole thing. I also think that she's learned a great deal from the experience of the tragedies in her family. And she's the one who said that basically there are two families and they're kind of different spectrums of each other. They're like mirror images of each other, but it's the Kennedys and the Hemingways. So I think she's giving us something of an insight there that's valuable. Okay, I wanted to get this story out real quick, and then we'll take the rest of your questions. Now, I did tell you that DeMohrenschildt, basically, there was a psychic involved with DeMohrenschildt's activities also. I'm flashing back now to George DeMohrenschildt, who's the character who was like best friends and this real kind of helper to Lee Harvey Oswald when he was here, but he was also in Haiti working for the CIA and working close with the person we started with, Joseph Dreyer. Now, DeMohrenschildt writes himself about his association with Crozet, and I want to just read a little bit of it. After our return from Haiti, we were literally assailed by a great number of journalists who wanted to interview us. The most interesting among them was Willem Altmans. Altmans is a United States representative of NOS Television. He is a Dutchman but educated in the United States, a Yale graduate. Told me how he became interested in the president's murder in 1964 while we were still in Haiti. He flew to Dallas in March of 64 and goes on. He's going on. And he talked to Marguerite Oswald, who's Oswald's mother. So this journalist is talking to him, who's from the Netherlands. The two sat together during the following dinner flight, and it was during this journey that Altmans first began to doubt the truth as to whether Lee Oswald was behind the killing of President Kennedy all by himself. It was Marguerite Oswald who told him that the chief of police in Dallas interrogated Lee for 48 hours without making a tape of it, which is absolutely true. Obviously, you don't want any answers on the record. So now, the recording of the hearing and even keeping notes. When the Warren Commission asked the Dallas police official whether they didn't think Oswald was important enough subject to borrow a tape recorder for the investigation, the answer was no, we just didn't have anything available. It's the most ridiculous thing. Upon returning to the Netherlands, Altman discussed his conversation with Marguerite Oswald with the famous clairvoyant Gerard Crozet in the Netherlands. It was Doubleday who published in 1964 the biography of this amazing Dutchman, and the guy had quite an interesting track record on the psychic side. It was Crozet who first described to Altmans in a tape recorded interview, which is being kept at the Institute of Parapsychology, that I existed. Crozet told Altmans that Lee had a friend in Dallas in his 50s. He described my physical features, including my name, held the letters ACH and the word DE. This is all before Altmans met DeMohrenschildt. The psychic is picking up on it. Altmans immediately consulted the chief of programs at National Dutch Television, Karel Eckenlaar. He received the assignment to return to Dallas and try to locate this mysterious friend of Oswald's, who, according to the Dutch clairvoyant, was of noble descent and was a geologist. He kept seeing this mysterious X. According to Crozet, the architect of the ambush in which Kennedy had been killed Oswald was only the fall guy, and it was this mysterious X that had been behind it. Altman's returned to Fort Worth and visited Marguerite Oswald. So he goes on there for some time, and I'm going to get to the good part. Now, check this out. When Altman's reported that he had contacted me, the Dutch TV president felt Altman's was in grave danger. They reasoned that so many people, directly or indirectly connected with trying to unravel the Kennedy assassination, had been killed or mysteriously disappeared. Yeah, in fact, they hired someone to do the odds on all the people who had died during the Warren Commission, all the witnesses. And the witness elimination program was pretty hardcore back then. And the odds that had been calculated by the actuary in London were 100,000 trillion to 1 that those people would, one, be dead and would have died the way that they did. So let's think about that. It's definitely on overdrive. So anyway, there's a fun thing in here about Crozet and how it got to Robert Kennedy. Tim Hogan said the senator was making a speech in Albany that morning and was flying back at 1 p.m. in the Caroline. He would inform the senator immediately, relaying Altman's request whether he could have some protection from the FBI. Robert Kennedy was then the Attorney General of the United States. Tim Hogan called back around 2 p.m. in Altman's apartment in New York. He relayed to Altman's, who's the journalist, that RFK had personally picked up the phone and talked to J. Edgar Hoover in Washington, D.C., and FBI agents were to contact him later that day. Now, this is all because, basically, Crozet had this vision that there was this mysterious X factor who was behind the JFK thing, and Altman's was in America, and that he could be in danger. So Altman's then left on the FBI's notice. Altman's left the United States. The next evening, Altman's wanted to visit an Indonesian friend in Greenwich Village who was designing a cover book for Altman's. He was writing about the late president of Indonesia. Driving southward on Westward Drive about 8 p.m. in a Sunbeam Tiger with a V8 motor convertible sports model and aluminum racing wheels, about 60 miles an hour, Altman's was being overtaken by a cab with a passenger riding in the back seat. The cab cruised for a while next to Altman's car until 53rd Street exit was reached. Then the cab made a fast move in which Altman's was cut off in such a way that he crashed into the rails. His car was a total loss. His head was bleeding. He was brought to the Kew Gardens Hospital where he was examined, bandaged, and sent home. The insurance awarded him 10 days, a new car. Altman's quickly shipped off to the Netherlands, terrified. He himself left a few days afterwards. 2 months later, Altman's received in his bungalow in the country near Utrecht in the Netherlands a telephone call from a certain Glenn Byron Smith, attorney from Fort Lauderdale, Florida. Smith announced that he was conducting an investigation into the JFK murder for an author of The Green Berets. He wanted to discuss with Altman's the Dallas affair and compare notes. During the conversation, he cautioned Altman's in the presence to stop investigating President Kennedy's assassination because you would not be the first person to die or disappear in the matter. What you do is they'll kidnap you at a New York street, drive you to a private airport, and dump you over the Atlantic Ocean. You would not be the first person to die this way either. Altman's remained unperturbed. He waited a few months, publishing an extensive report. So they move on here. From that moment on, this Dutch journalist who initially approached us because he had received indications that we might be involved indirectly through Oswald with the Kennedy assassination became a very personal friend. Now, here's a weird cap to this situation. So basically that was Crozet said, find this guy. He's an associate of Oswald. And as soon as Altman's, this journalist, found DeMohrenschildt, he felt, everyone told him, oh, you're in danger. Something's going to happen to you. But DeMohrenschildt was like, oh, no, I want to get the answers too. So he was sort of playing along. At the end of his life, however, DeMohrenschildt is freaking out because they're calling him before the House Assassinations Committee, and he's worrying, what's going to happen to me? They're trying to pin this murder on me through Oswald, and they killed Oswald and all this stuff. So he freaks out, and he goes with the journalist to Crozet, and Crozet sits down with him, and he said, oh my God, the people you've been dealing with. I can't believe it. There's such darkness, and how could you ever have dealt with those people? And so the journalist looks And he's looking at DeMohrenschildt, and he's like, and DeMohrenschildt looks at him and says, "You're all setting me up," and he runs out of the room. And of course, when he comes back to America, he does commit suicide. But Crozet had him there, and he had this thing that, like, the people that set up the assassination, DeMohrenschildt was very close to. And we have to remember in all of this, the person that DeMohrenschildt had befriended and had set up had started off as a 15-year-old Civil Air Patrol kid in New Orleans who intelligence people had groomed for different missions and sent around the world. And they would eventually wind up pinning that whole murder on this guy. And it's a complete farce, of course, because we all know the story itself, the magic bullet, the whole joke about it. But the CIA, the Central Intelligence Agency, and these forces working behind the scenes, we have to remember, again, how they control history. And this is one of their major goals. So when we're talking about Operation Atlantis, it is part of that deep history that they're trying to control, the political side and the deeper mystery school history side. Yes, Ms. Olivia.
Okay, Matt M. DJ mentioned the hot zone was an interface with the spiritual. What did he mean? And a cult fan said, is there a connection between sensitives and creatives having this sort of attraction to these areas, or do the higher forces draw us there?
Oh, wow. Well, there's no question that I've seen, when I talk to psychics and it has anything to do with the hot zone, it seems to me that something special comes through about it. And it's my feeling that there's some psychic residue from the Atlantean culture. Remember, the way that Casey describes them is all of their activities are psychic. They're a completely telepathic race. So, and the things that they leave behind, we might be looking for, a pyramid or a temple or whatever it is, but they can also leave behind layers, etheric layers of energy, basically. The other question is interesting, though, too, because there is obviously something going on in the hot zone that pertains to the same type of unusual electromagnetic phenomena. One of the greatest things that I've seen was this whistleblower from AUTEC, and we played him, I think, in episode 36. We played a tape of him describing what he saw, and what happens is he's working for AUTEC, and he's right off the coast of Andros, and what happens is a landmass appears, and it's on his radar, and he's like, well, what is that? It's not a ship, it's not a submarine or whatever, it's a landmass. Now there's another captain of a Navy captain in his interview that I've looked at, and he's going along late at night, and he's in the hot zone, and then suddenly this thing shows up. And he looks up and he said, it's so far up that we can't figure out what it is, but it almost seems like it's metal. It's gray metal. And everything starts to go crazy on, all these apotheum effects happen. Everything starts to go crazy on the ship. And there's a certain point where he says, we have to turn around and just get out of here. I can't even investigate it. There's such strange things that go on in the hot zone, in the Bermuda Triangle, in the Bahamas, around Bimini. And the more that you get into it, you have to see that there's some kind of vortex of energy there, and it is definitely a leftover of this apotheum effect that took place when Atlantis went down, and that the two-eye crystals were manipulated in such a way that they were actually working in reverse. So whatever that did, it messed with the physics and created this distorted reality distortion. So that area echoes that, but it also echoes this strange kind of supernatural, spiritual ability that the Atlanteans had. And I think that is it's very much apparent when people are there. They get a sense for that. And I've talked to people who spend time down there, and it seems to me beyond just the great vacationing and all the rest of it, it has those types of qualities way more than, say, if you're hanging out in New York. Yes, Ms. Olivia.
Jane Sewell.
Uh-huh.
I haven't missed an X series yet. Is there any information, indications on what we might expect when Atlantis rises? Are there any Casey readings in regard to this?
Yes.
What would that look like?
Well, it's very interesting because remember, this is the good news and the bad news. Part of what he says is that, of course, these lands will be rising as others are sinking. So one of the things that he predicted was the destruction of California. Some of the things, he had a very interesting dream one time, which I think is powerful, that he woke up and he lived in Nebraska, and Nebraska was on the coast. My guess is that it was the West Coast, and that whole other portion of land had sunken or moved around. He had made other predictions that eventually the Great Lakes will empty into the Gulf of Mexico. So we need a real geologist to figure out what that would make the map of the United States look like. But there's no question that it's going to cause a great change in consciousness and how we view things. But Atlantis rising, it seems to me one of those things that's inevitable. And I have to say, in relation to UFO disclosure, things like that, these things are all associated. But it seems to me from people that I've talked with, when you go really deep on it, the Atlantis secret might be even a bigger one than the off-world civilization secret, because in truth, it represents us in a very supra-normal state. The Atlanteans were, remember, in that period when men walked as gods. So they had that complete control of those universal forces. That type of resonance with the spiritual beings that we are is exactly what's played down in culture now, where they really have rolled out this kind of junk culture thing. So I think that that's a very significant way of looking at this. One quick thing is a couple of shots. Well, here's a shot of Ernest with Jack, and that's Ernest there, and that's Jack in his uniforms. There's Gregory, actually, Ernest's youngest son, who became a transsexual and called himself Gloria, and really had a very unusual life. And this is part of the, he really had so many problems with his upbringing under Ernest, and how Ernest's whole, you got to be a man's man type thing. Gregory Hemingway was definitely unusual. You could do a whole show on him. It's quite
you could do a whole
character.
show on the homosexual angle to the JFK assassination in the CIA.
That's true.
Yeah,
that's true.
What did you just tell me about DeMohrenschildt? Is that how many times had he been married?
He had 4 wives, but 3 out of the 4 wives said that he was gay, basically. And what's interesting about that to me is that there are groups. There are mystery school groups that are all men, and some of them are coming directly from that place that it is literally their lives are about men. And so when you look at people like Hoover, who never married anyone, and we all know about his cross-dressing, David Ferry and his manipulation of Oswald, that's all very, there's all those homosexual aspects to it. There are so many aspects like that around the JFK assassination. It's quite
and then with
remarkable.
Hemingway, right? With his mother dressing him like a little girl.
Yeah,
right?
well, and him feeling that he had to be a real man's man as a result of that, so that he would, he would take guys on in bars who were twice his size and things like that. So it is, there's a lot of gender stuff at play when you get around the Hemingways. There's no question about it. There are other pressures too. And I found that a lot with Marielle and Margot, really working together right off the bat in Lipstick, a major movie. And then Marielle actually outshining her and becoming her kind of target, Margot's target, because she was getting so great at becoming this, Academy Award winning star. So there was a lot of strange, there were so many unusual elements with the Hemingways. I think they're absolutely fascinating, but the kind of mystical overhang is the piece I think that is the least investigated. And that's what I think we're going into here. I mentioned this earlier, but that is the headline from the Smithsonian, how Mary Hemingway and JFK got Ernest Hemingway's legacy out of Cuba. And that is the official vault story in the Smithsonian, but I think there's a much deeper story, because the official story says that the vault information went to the Kennedy Library. We know they have a great deal of material. However, there were assistants to Mary Hemingway who said she kept her own version of the vault in a bank in New York City. So what was in that? The idea that they're going to risk, international crisis trying to get some of Hemingway's books out of Cuba doesn't wash. It's something else. So I couldn't resist this one, of course. That's Ernest and Mary Hemingway. And there's
Beautiful shot with a nice big X.
yeah, there you go.
Mhm.
So we'll take a couple more questions. Everyone, you're watching the Dark Journalist program. I'm here with the lovely Olivia. We're going through your questions, and we're exploring Operation Atlantis, JFK and the Ernest Hemingway mystery. I've seen some great people out there. Scarlet 5, I haven't seen you in a while. And was Rika out there?
Not tonight.
Not tonight. But definitely just a fantastic group and great questions so far. We'll take a few more, and then we're going to wrap up this powerful episode. Yes.
Okay, we have someone in the chat named Alpha Warrior who seems to know McAfee.
Oh.
But is asking, did Oliver Stone get clearance to make his JFK movie, or did he get death threats? Can't believe Hollywood would let him make that without consequences, or was it set up to deceive?
The movie? No, I think the movie tells a really good story.
It's shocking it was made.
Yeah, I think the thing is that Stone had enough clout. And I was recently talking to Sean Stone, and I was talking to him a little bit about this, which was that it is such a breakthrough, I think, to have the movie about JFK be with Garrison, because Garrison was the one who really looked at the CIA aerospace aspect. And eventually he came to the conclusion that it's an aerospace company, that the conspiracy resides inside of these aerospace companies. That's where the forces that assassinated President Kennedy were. It's a very shocking thing. And remember, when all these records were coming out, the records that they were blocking on the CIA side were all the Garrison records. There were more. But they did not want that coming out, because remember, they had to thwart his investigation, which they did. And that movie really tells the story, I think, and holds up remarkably well. Just an incredible film. Yes, Miss Livia.
Interesting. James Clement says he made it for the CIA. It's a disinformation campaign. I could not disagree more.
Oh, about the movie JFK?
Mm-hmm.
Well, you'd have to, I mean, it doesn't show the CIA in a good light, so I don't know what you'd be referring to, but it's interesting. I mean,
and he's paid the price in Hollywood.
Oh, not only that, but the media went after it even before it came out. They had a draft of the script that they leaked, and then they went after the draft of the script in Time magazine. I mean, the entire CIA apparatus of the Washington Post, Time magazine, all that stood up against it. So it doesn't quite wash that way. But, I'm always open-minded. I'm always open-minded to hear whatever you have to say. Yes.
Okay, big Papa Pump.
Uh-huh.
Any ideas how Epstein Island relates to the HotZone and the Aramonic groups associated with Atlantis?
Well, I think it is for another episode, but it is interesting to me when you go down there. There's a kind of lawlessness associated with places like the Cayman Islands, where we know that money just gets hoarded by these millionaires. And Fitz was telling me these stories that she heard, and this is like from back in the 80s and 90s, when people were just going back and forth with suitcases of money to the Cayman Islands. So there is that aspect down there. That's why I think the McAfee thing was kind of interesting, because when McAfee was down there, to have this libertarian guy who likes to expose things, I mean, he's definitely volatile personality, but to start to expose what's in the hot zone is definitely dangerous stuff. And I think that they wanted a guy like that out of there. They didn't want him around. But I do think that it is the lawlessness that attracts them to it, that they feel that they can get away with things out of the public eye, or this little strip of land isn't subject to U.S. law, for example, and all these corporations can shuttle their money through the Cayman Islands. Yeah, it was set up really quite well by the CIA. No wonder Kennedy fired Dulles, because he knew he'd try to lie him into invading Cuba. And it was a hard thing to do, because Dulles was a sacred cow for CIA. He had been CIA director for a decade, And he basically had set it up. Remember this, the CIA wasn't set up by a bunch of foreign policy people. It was set up by Wall Street lawyers. And he was a Wall Street lawyer from Sullivan and Cromwell. So again, whose interests are they protecting? Let's get right down to it. Yes, Ms.
Okay,
Linda.
Emmanuel Barron.
Uh-huh.
Would Cuba have an underground cave system that connects with Atlantis?
I think that underground cave system does, and it is something that when you look at it, you say, oh, this is quite unusual because these caves continue underwater. And if it is sunken, then you have to think, well, one of the great things that they did when they were living in those caves is whoever the initiates were in Cuba at the time, they made those incredible astrological paintings and describing these very hardcore astronomical alignments. So that stuff and the ruins and things like that must continue in those caves. It's probably a perfect way to preserve things. And you know, one of the things that we found out about Giza is that there's an incredible cave system in the Giza complex. Now, no one can get in there because it's all bats and everything else. But when you think about what Casey had to say about the Hall of Records and the way that they would bury it, caves would have been the way to go. And this certainly is true in the hot zone as well. I think more is coming out about Cuba, and I think that we're giving some of that light with some of the things that we're talking about tonight, because Cuba has got to be a major focus for the Atlantis rising aspect. And we're seeing again, even with the Bay of Pigs location for this underwater island from the ARE study, I mean, that's pretty explosive. There's no doubt about it. Okay.
Jonathan Fries, are most of the entrances for these caves where the U.S. has built their top secret bases?
Well, they do have incredible bases in the Atlantic. AUTEC, remember, stretches across Andros, but we also have Gitmo over there. And we hear all sorts of things about, hey, Hillary and Soros is going to Gitmo, right? That's supposed to be some sort of intel drop. Well, that never happens. But I'll tell you what does happen there off of Guantanamo Bay is exactly those types of underwater experiments. And I remember a story about a diver who dove off of AUTEC and saw this cable that kept going on and kept going on, and then it went into the tongue of the ocean, which goes 6,000 feet down. What on earth is down there that a cable could be going to? So AUTEC, I know that AUTEC was hiring remote viewers, and they had Joe McMoneagle in that one fascinating episode from, it was UFO Hunters. It's from a while ago now. It's like 2009 maybe.
Probably earlier.
But it exposed a lot about AUTEC in a very short period of time. And I think it's their last episode, or second to last. And the guy who was doing... It was
the last one they made. It may not have been the last one to air, because they got them canceled.
That's what the word was. Look, AUTEC is very much like Area 51. We don't know what the hell is going on there. We don't know the technology that they're using, the funding mechanisms that they have. So many things can happen outside of our purview. What kind of oversight does AUTEC have? Military testing facility in the middle of the ocean? I mean, that's about as loose as you can get. So if you want to practice with some of that darker technology, that's a good place to go. Absolutely great questions tonight. We'll take one more question and we'll wrap it up from here, but I'm absolutely amazed at the whole thing. And it's great to have everyone out there tonight. Great questions. Cult fan, really good.
There's too many questions I didn't get to. I'm going to just throw out a good question that's not on topic. If it's going to be the last question.
Sure.
Brenda Fisher. Buzz Aldrin recently said there needs to be an international cooperation in space, not competition. Is he ex-share?
Well, you know, I think that certainly we can take a look at some people like Gordon Cooper and say that they were ex-share. And they were associated with the Kennedys. And remember, we have all that stuff and the different coordinates that Cooper saved. In terms of Aldrin, I think that he was so messed up by the secrecy around the moon mission that if you read his biography, he talks about how he drank a lot and he had nervous exhaustion and he went into hospitals and stuff. It's very unusual, very, very unusual. for me, there are so many secrets around the moon landing, and certainly the fact that we did go there, no question about it. However, I think that the things that were involved, and this comes out in Dr. Farrell's work, for example, the things that were involved when we went there, the things that we saw were not reported. And there was a great remote viewer named Ingo Swann who remote viewed the moon for this unusual group that smuggled him into a government facility, by blindfolding him and stuff. And a lot of them were twins. Very, very unusual story in his kind of out of print book now called Penetration. And he saw all kinds of activities and all kinds of towers and ruins and things on the moon. So I think that there's definitely a bigger story there about the things that we discovered. This is the nature of the problem. But I'd like to think a guy like that is ex-share, because we need more of them. There's no question about it. Ex-protect, every time you turn around, there's ex-protect aspects going on, or caricatures of ex-protect, like the TTSA. Anytime you get the CIA involved at that level, it's, that's total ex-protect action. But, don't get me wrong, the very heavy ex-protect stuff that we've described in this program comes out of the CIA and those types of groups using almost like astral agencies. And that's where you get the whole Men in Black problem and all the rest of it. That was a great question. You can do one more.
I want to link these two. I really wanted to ask these. Okay, Alistair Barker. Does it matter what world figureheads do or say? And Shamanist Anam Kara says, so things will change at some point in the future away from the Nazi rule and influence, right? I wonder if you could address, I think everyone is sensing, everyone's angry and frustrated and getting a little bit lost in that emotion, and not, everybody wants justice all of a sudden. They're focused on the injustice.
Yes.
And what we can do individually and collectively, what we need to do to bring about change in this world.
Absolutely. Well, look, the good side had a very good week. If you think about it, I mean, the Epstein arrest in the past couple of weeks, this is absolutely incredible.
And they didn't actually succeed in suiciding him.
That's true.
Right? That's great news.
True. They've busted up some interesting rings, I think, recently, too. I can't say that I buy the complete kind of gloomy forecast, because there's so many elements going on. I know there's so many good people working out there. Catherine Austin Fitts is out there. Joseph Farrell's work is outstanding. I always cite Alexander Bruce from Forbidden Knowledge TV. Chi-Chi Young's work on the psychic side. There's so many things for us to pursue there. And then when you think about all of these different people pulling their various talents and bringing these things forward, there is cause for optimism there. Now, I think we are looking also at Robert Kennedy Jr. and the things that he's doing, fighting this real kind of vaccine mafia thing that's going on with the pharmaceutical companies. It is remarkable. There are people and there are movements. So we have to really keep that in mind as we go forward on this. And a lot of them sometimes show up right here in the chat, in the ideas room. And so we're very close to all this. It is important not to lose our head. And, it's interesting. I listened to one of the last conversations of Tracy Twyman, and she called into a program before her death. And she said that she was going to try to concentrate on things more responsibly, because she felt she had done really great, work, but that there was too much of a habit going on of people latching on to weird or negative stories. And that one of the last gifts that she probably imparted to us there was that she wanted to kind of adopt this responsibility in her reporting. And I think that's important for us too, not to get overwhelmed, but to look to the kind of ex-share side and to see what types of things may be going on there. not selling us the false hopium, and the Q type stuff and say everything's fine, don't worry about it, the good guys have it under control, TikTok and all that stuff. I don't buy any of that. I think every little inch has to be won. And but I do feel that there is cause for optimism, no question about it. That's why we're here, and that's why we're bringing forward these stories. But I run across it in incredible people and the work that they're doing. And I remember when I was doing all these stories and I was including things about Cuban fireballs, and I don't know if Kate is out there tonight, but Kate sent me all this stuff, and she had been tracking these things about fireballs in Cuba and Venezuela. She had an incredible program for how these things were happening. And so, people are doing great research in all these different pockets. So, we definitely have to kind of pool that as much as we can. But it's very much like what Gurdjieff said about the mystery schools is, they are just this kind of small pearl in the middle of all this, and that the pearl aspect kind of increases as it goes along, but it's not this huge major movement. It starts in this very kind of crystal form. So it's a good way to look at it. Look at Paulina Zalitsky and the incredible legacy of her work, finding basically Atlantis off Cuba. So what I think is important with like Steiner's work and Casey's work, they've given us a legacy, and it's all about now, how do we utilize the things that they've given us out there? But it is remarkable, and thank you so much, everyone. The Ernest Hemingway mystery, even after an episode like this, I feel like we're only getting so many levels deep. But certainly Joseph Dreyer and Ernest Hemingway being there with his wedding and his association with Dreyer, and Dreyer being close to DeMohrenschildt, who was part of the JFK assassination, is pretty much off the charts. There's one final thing I want to read, which means that opens up for you, Miss Olivia, the opportunity to hop in with another question, because I don't have
It's a heavy question.
All right.
Okay, Matt M. Did Steiner ever say if the 90% genocide of humanity could be prevented, or is it a rite of passage for humanity? Does Ahriman really want to kill us all off?
Yes is the answer to that question.
Well, this is an interesting, I think he's trying to feel sorry for Ahriman and redeem him. This
is an interesting one.
I know. Maybe he wants to be freed of his pain. So he wants his nature transformed. It's an interesting take on it. Maybe you should take that in pieces.
Well, I will say this, that Steiner said not to run from Ahriman, but to be prepared to face it. And then in facing it, kind of meet the challenge and rise ourselves. So in that sense, absolutely. And it does transform those figures too. However, they are horrifying transhumanist, figures. So it's not going to be easy, put it to you that way.
But you know what? I'm going to just insert this. I'm tired of thinking about the enemy. This community is always focused on the enemy, the bad guy. We cannot create anything positive and good from focusing on our foe.
Well, that is the 2 minutes hate thing from 1984. I absolutely agree. It becomes too much of an addiction to do that. But I will say this, there was one final piece I wanted to impart as we exit here, and it has to do with one last bit about DeMohrenschildt, and this is very interesting and important. So when DeMohrenschildt dies, they drag our friend Joseph Dreyer before the House Assassinations Committee, and they say, tell us what you know. And he says, well, one thing I can tell you is that when President Kennedy was assassinated, DeMohrenschildt received $250,000 in his account. And that it was, in fact, this woman who had run this establishment in Haiti that had told him that, who was closely associated with DeMohrenschildt. And I think that that could have been a payoff for DeMohrenschildt shepherding Oswald into the role of the patsy. But it is quite unique sum of money back then, $250,000, to be deposited in his account as soon as the assassination happens. very important piece of information. The other piece of information that I think we get from Dreyer on the way out here, that I'll leave you with a flash, which is Dreyer also said that it was Allen Dulles that introduced him to DeMohrenschildt. So let's think about that, because Dreyer did all these things with DeMohrenschildt, and they even wrote letters to President Johnson together. But if he knew, if it was Dulles who knew DeMohrenschildt and set him up with Dreyer, then Dulles could have been running DeMohrenschildt the whole time, which means Dulles could have been running the Oswald operation from the get-go using DeMohrenschildt. Let's think about that, and also think about how that relates to all the activities around Cuba in the hot zone.
Would you say that Allen Dulles is probably the most powerful man of the 20th century, when you can, the most influential?
Well, him and his brother,
yeah,
because the brother was Secretary of State, John Foster Dulles, and between the two of them, they really shaped the map. There's no question about it, and most of it originally right from S&C. In New York. So just incredible. Wow, what a power grab. But there were forces like JFK who thwarted that. And remember, JFK fired Dulles. So that's really ex-share and ex-protect in action. I mean, at the highest level, it really is. It's a great snapshot of those two. Yes.
Okay, Esoteric 369 Wall said, Olivia, please ask Daniel time and place of the SSP conference, please.
Yes, well, I will tell you this, that there are some very important live events coming up. And if you are on the newsletter, you will get all the updates. Go to darkjournalist.com, make sure that you're signed up for the newsletter. Like I said, it's free, but you guys are going to get the first, just as the people who found out about Graham Hancock, because that's where we announced it first, and they got their tickets and they were all set. So highly recommend it. The other thing is sign up at darkjournalist.com, subscribe to the show, become a part of it, become a member. You're going to want those reports on the hot zone coming up. And it's incredibly affordable. Like I think it's $5 a month, and we want everyone to be able to access it. And we'll keep it that way as long as we can. But definitely, this is the time to do it. On our way out, I am going to once again remind us that when these people, for example, like Jack Hemingway here, put tremendous pressure on his own daughters, actually, and by keeping these types of secrets and family secrets and the types of things that would go on, and you think about the price that the family pays for that wall of secrecy. You can extrapolate that out, that the wall of secrecy on society really has that very same effect. And I think that in the case of the Hemingways, they've articulated it very well, so that there's a point where they've gone through so much. And some of them didn't get to tell us all about it, like Margot. But in the case of Mariel, I think that she did, in fact, face up incredibly well to that pressure and just try to figure out where it was coming from. So those types of things, those types of secrets in the CIA and the impact on those families, this story echoes around a lot. And there's a lot of that dysfunction. And it's coming from that place of grasping for political power. And I think it's made segments of the society as a whole very schizophrenic. And that's why unraveling it, and showing it to the public and bringing that to light is really a way where we can really get a handle back on the truth, really, in that sense. So these people, I think, have suffered the brunt of that type of secrecy. And with that, Miss Olivia, I think the the question of the night is, what's for dinner?
Well, you always do that, but I have to thank some super chatters first.
Hey. Oh, yes.
Okay, so Bill Gomez, Tricky Vicky, Eric Ackerley, Alicia Gardelli, Guidarelli. I want to make sure I get that right.
Nice.
Jesselyn and Big Papa Pump. Thank you so much. And now I am detoxing, as you know. I'm drinking my green juice. So there's going to be no quesadilla and no tequila.
Look at you go. That's very impressive.
I am detoxing from Twitter, and I'm detoxing from negativity, and I'm detoxing from non-organic food.
It's mega detox week.
Yes.
That's the way to go.
Well, probably month. Probably August, I'm going to do it.
That's a great way to go. Well, you're a great inspiration to us all. That's all I can say. we will see you next week, and we have some exciting shows coming up. This is going to be the last X series for a little while, but we're going to be coming back with some live interviews, and we're coming back with X episode 62. We will be coming back in a few weeks with that one. Everyone has been great out there. What do I see? A cult fan. Excellent to see you, Bruce Wayne. Thank you. Mark Anthony, Craig Coleman. It's great to have you out there. And Victor Surge, Gaia Sophia. Yeah, I've seen a lot of very familiar names out there. Wow, it's great to have you guys here. And thanks so much for going with us deep into the hot zone. We will see you next week. And also, Najat, it's great to have you out there. Of course, Kate, who I mentioned earlier. Esoteric 369, very nice to have you out there. Thanks so much. And remember to have a fantastic weekend. So many interesting stories to cover. And a lot of them really good. A lot of them really good. There's a few horror shows, but there's some other stuff that's pretty decent.
Yeah, and I want to say, don't waste too much time with your nose in the phone. Go outside, go for a walk, enjoy the sun, enjoy the summer. It won't be here long. Right?
That's a really good point, actually. That was good. That was actually, it's a public service announcement via Olivia. Thanks so much, everyone. We'll see you next week.
Thanks, everybody.
And of course, for some reason, I took out the book, Maps of the Ancient Sea Kings, but I didn't even mention why. But there is a picture on the Piraeus map of Bimini, and it has weird structures on it. And that map is old. So they knew what they were talking about. Great book. And just in case anyone was curious, here's the fearsome dictator himself, Papa Doc. Unbelievable. Menace to humanity, but CIA propped him up. That's the way that they roll. And on the other end of the fence, we had a young ambulance driver who got inspired by getting blown up by a shell to figure out there was more to life. That was Ernest Hemingway in 1919. Good thought to leave you with right there. That kind of dark to light. And we will see you next week.
Okay. Good night, everybody.
Duvalier.
Snappy dresser. Gotta say that. He's posh.
That's probably how he got in.